Hello everyone, and welcome back to Sleepy Scares. I know many of you tune in to unwind and drift off into a peaceful sleep, so before you settle in, I'd love for you to drop a comment, letting me know where in the world you're listening from. If you're enjoying the episodes, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Now, let's get cozy, relax, and dive right in. Story 1. Deep in the heart of Ebonwood Canyon, a place few dared to venture, lay an abandoned settlement known as Whisper's End. The name came not from its remoteness, but from the unsettling phenomenon visitors reported. Faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere. The settlement was nestled between jagged cliffs, shadowed by gnarled trees that clawed at the sky like skeletal hands. Samantha Gray, a documentary filmmaker with a penchant for the paranormal, had heard of Whisper's End through a local folklore enthusiast. Skeptics dismissed it as a hoax or mass hysteria, but Samantha was determined to uncover the truth. Armed with her camera, recording equipment, and a flashlight, she ventured into the canyon at dusk. The trek was arduous. Narrow trails hugged steep cliffs, and the air grew colder with each step. By the time Samantha reached the settlement, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the canyon in twilight hues. Whisper's End was eerily still. Dilapidated wooden cabins lined the overgrown paths, their windows dark and yawning like empty sockets. Setting up her equipment in the central square, Samantha began her investigation. She spoke into her camera, documenting the chilling atmosphere. This place feels heavy, like the air itself is pressing down on me. There's no wildlife, no sound except for the wind. As the night deepened, Samantha roamed the settlement, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. She entered one of the cabins, its door hanging loosely on rusted hinges. Inside, the walls were adorned with strange symbols carved into the wood. Spirals, jagged lines, and crude stick figures with hollow eyes. A sudden sound made her spin around. It wasn't the wind. It was a whisper. Soft, unintelligible, but unmistakable. She raised her camera, scanning the room, but it was empty. Her breath quickened as the whisper grew louder, overlapping, until they formed a cacophony of murmurs. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The whispers ceased. In the silence that followed, the floorboards groaned under an invisible weight. Then, a single voice spoke, clear and chilling. "Leave." Samantha bolted from the cabin, her camera clutched tightly. Outside, the once still air was now alive with movement. Shadows flickered among the trees, though there was no light source to cast them. The whispers resumed, swirling around her like a storm, desperate to document the phenomenon. Samantha set her camera on a tripod in the square and let it record as she turned in circles, searching for the source of the whispers. Her flashlight caught fleeting glimpses of figures, tall, gaunt shapes with glowing eyes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. One by one, the whispers formed words. They took our voices. They took our voices. They took everything. Samantha's mind raced. Who were they? She had read no accounts of violence or mass death in the settlement's history. Yet the voices were filled with anguish and rage, as though they had been wronged in unimaginable ways. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble. Cracks spiderwebbed through the square, and from the largest fissure emerged a hand, skeletal, yet pulsing with dark energy. Samantha stumbled back as more hands clawed their way out, attached to figures that defied explanation. Their bodies were shadowy and insubstantial, yet their faces were grotesquely human, frozen in expressions of pain and terror. Grabbing her camera, Samantha ran toward the canyon trail, the whispers now a deafening roar. The shadows pursued her, their clawed hands reaching out, their glowing eyes piercing the darkness. She slipped and fell, her flashlight skittering out of reach. In the faint beam of its light, she saw the canyon's edge, a sheer drop into oblivion. The figures closed in, their whispers coalescing into a single word. Stay. Samantha screamed, flailing in the dirt as she crawled toward her flashlight. Just as the shadows reached her, she grabbed the light and shone it directly at them. The beam cut through their forms, causing them to writhe and dissipate with an ear-splitting shriek. Scrambling to her feet, Samantha didn't stop running until she was miles from the settlement. When she finally reached her car, she collapsed into the driver's seat, shaking uncontrollably. Her camera was still intact, the memory card holding proof of her ordeal. Back in the safety of her home, Samantha reviewed the footage. The shadows were barely visible. The whispers faint but present. However, in the final moments of the recording, as she fled the settlement, a voice spoke clearly into the microphone. You escaped, but we remain. Whisper's end was later sealed off by authorities after Samantha's documentary gained widespread attention. But even now, late at night, those who live near Ebonwood Canyon swear they hear faint whispers carried on the wind. Whispers that seem to call their names. Story 2. In the dense wilderness of Blackthorn Woods, there stood a forgotten railway tunnel carved deep into the hills. Locals called it the Crawling Hollow, a place avoided even in daylight. Stories circulated of a shadowy entity that emerged from the tunnel, crawling along the ground like spilled ink, devouring anything that crossed its path. Marlon Trent, an urban explorer and skeptic, heard about the hollow through an online forum and dismissed the tales as small-town superstition. Determined to prove the stories were nothing more than exaggerated myths, he set out with a camera, a lantern, and a sturdy pair of hiking boots. The sun hung low as Marlon trudged through the thick underbrush, following an old map that led to the tunnel. The woods were unnaturally silent, the usual chorus of birds and insects absent. His footsteps crunched loudly on the leaf-strewn path, the sound jarring in the oppressive quiet. When he reached the entrance to the tunnel, the air felt heavier, colder. The archway was crumbling, its edges consumed by moss and creeping ivy. A rusted sign lay half buried in the dirt, the faded letters barely legible. Blackthorn Mine, closed indefinitely. The tunnel yawned before him, a black void that seemed to pulse with an unseen menace. Marlon set up his camera on a tripod, ensuring it was angled to capture the entire entrance. He turned on his lantern, its weak beam barely penetrating the inky darkness. Steeling himself, he stepped inside. The smell hit him first. Damp earth and something metallic, like rusted iron. The walls were slick with condensation, the faint drip of water echoing eerily. Marlon walked slowly, his lantern casting wavering shadows that seemed to dance and stretch unnaturally. He paused to examine the ground, noticing deep grooves etched into the stone, as if something heavy had been dragged through. A low, guttural sound made him freeze. It wasn't the wind, it was a growl, deep and resonant, coming from further within. His heart pounded as he swung the lantern around, the beam trembling in his grasp. For a moment, he saw nothing but the endless darkness. Then, something moved. It was subtle at first, like the shifting of liquid. A black, viscous shape began to seep out of the darkness, pooling onto the tunnel floor. It moved unnaturally, flowing against gravity, its surface rippling as if alive. Marlon stumbled backward, nearly dropping his lantern. The shadow grew, spreading across the ground like an oil spill. Within its depths, faint outlines of faces appeared, twisted, agonized visages that seemed to scream soundlessly. The growl returned, louder this time, resonating through the tunnel and shaking the walls. Marlin turned and ran, his boots slipping on the damp stone as the shadow surged after him. It moved faster than he thought possible, a writhing mass that swallowed the light. He could feel its cold tendrils licking at his heels, an unnatural chill that seeped into his bones. The tunnel entrance came into view, the faint glow of twilight spilling inside. Marlin pushed himself harder, his lungs burning as he burst out into the open air. He didn't stop running until he reached the clearing where he left his car. Gasping for breath, he looked back, expecting to see the shadow spilling out of the tunnel. But the entrance was empty, its gaping maw as still and silent as when it arrived. Shaking, Marlin climbed into his car and sped off, leaving Blackthorn Woods behind. When he finally returned home, he reviewed the footage from his camera, desperate to understand what he'd encountered. The video showed the tunnel entrance, dark and unremarkable, until the moment he turned to flee. Then, the camera captured it. The shadow crawling out of the tunnel, its inky form writhing as if alive. The faces within it were clearer on the recording, their mouths opening in silent screams. And then, as Marlin ran, the shadow seemed to pause, turning toward the camera. A single hand emerged from its mass, skeletal and impossibly long, before the footage cut to static. Marlin couldn't sleep that night. The image of the shadow burned into his mind. Days turned into weeks, and he avoided the footage, locking it away in a drawer. But the nightmares persisted. Every night he dreamed of the shadow crawling toward him, its growl echoing in his ears. One night, Marlin woke to a familiar chill. The room was pitch black, the air heavy and oppressive. He reached for his bedside lamp, but it wouldn't turn on. Panic set in as he felt something cold and wet against his hand. Looking down, he saw it. The shadow spilling across his bedroom floor, reaching for him with countless skeletal hands. The last thing he heard was the growl, low and guttural, as the shadow enveloped him. Days later, Marlin's apartment was found empty, his belongings untouched. The footage of the crawling hollow was never recovered, but locals near Blackthorn Woods swear they've seen a figure wandering the forest, its movements stiff and unnatural. Some say it's Marlin, cursed to wander the woods as one of the faces within the shadow. Others say it's something else entirely. Something that's still hungry. Story 3. In a remote town of Thornville, nestled at the edge of a frozen lake, there was a legend that had been passed down for generations. It spoke of the eyes beneath the ice, creatures that lived deep in the lake's dark waters, their eyes glowing faintly beneath the surface, watching, waiting. The townsfolk spoke in hushed tones about the dangers of venturing too close to the ice in winter, for the creatures below had been known to reach up and drag the unsuspecting under. Sarah Moore, a winter photographer from the city, had heard the story but dismissed it as folklore. She was drawn to Thornville for its haunting beauty and the stillness of its frozen lake. The frozen expanse seemed like the perfect setting for her next project, capturing the contrast between the serene, icy landscape and the stark, dark trees that lined its edge. As Sarah ventured out onto the lake one crisp morning, the air was cold enough to make her breath visible, the sky a pale gray, the sunlight struggling to pierce the overcast sky. The ice beneath her boots was thick, its surface smooth and unmarred by cracks. The town was distant, its buildings small, almost hidden behind the veil of snow, leaving her alone in the vastness of the frozen world. Sarah set up her camera, capturing wide shots of the lake, the snowflakes falling like delicate whispers. She didn't believe in the old legends. There was no such thing as eyes beneath the ice, right? As she adjusted her lens, something caught her attention, a faint glow beneath the surface of the ice. She knelt down, wiping the snow away. and saw it. Two pale, glowing eyes staring up at her from the depths. At first, she thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection from the low sun. But as she stared longer, the eyes moved. They blinked, their gaze never wavering from hers. A chill ran through Sarah, not from the cold, but from the intense, unnatural presence that seemed to emanate from the ice. The eyes didn't look like those of an animal, or any creature she could recognize. They were too human, too filled with an unsettling intelligence. Sarah stumbled back, her heart pounding. The eyes followed her every movement, as if studying her. She quickly grabbed her camera, aiming it at the ice, her hands shaking. She snapped a photo, but as she lowered the camera, she saw that the eyes were no longer visible. The ice was completely clear again, the darkness below empty. Trying to shake off the unease, Sarah continued her work, dismissing the encounter as a strange trick of the mind. But as the day wore on, she noticed something disturbing. The glow had returned, this time beneath a different section of the ice. Then another set of eyes appeared, far off to her left, and another to the right. No matter where she moved on the lake, there were always eyes beneath the ice, watching her. As evening approached, Sarah realized she had ventured farther out onto the lake than she had intended. The wind had picked up, and the air was thick with snow, blurring her vision. She turned to head back to the shore, but as she moved, the ice beneath her feet groaned. A deep, resonant crack echoed through the lake, sending a shiver up her spine. The ice shifted, then cracked again, louder this time. Something was moving beneath her. Panic surged through her chest. She broke into a sprint, but the ice beneath her feet began to crack open, large fissures appearing with each step she took. Cracks were spreading toward her, racing from the dark spots where the eyes had been, as if the creatures below were reaching up, pulling at the surface. Sarah ran faster, the sound of cracking ice echoing in her ears. Behind her, something shifted under the ice. Great, rippling movements, as though something large was stirring beneath the frozen surface. She could hear the faint, eerie sound of something dragging itself along the bottom of the lake, like fingers scraping across the ice. She stumbled, falling hard to the ground as the ice cracked beneath her again, and her heart stopped in terror. A massive shape rose from the depths, a dark silhouette beneath the ice. It was enormous, its body contorting as it moved, its eyes glowing with the same eerie light she had seen earlier. But now they were far more numerous, filling the ice like an ocean of eyes. They were everywhere, watching, waiting. Watching, waiting. Sarah tried to push herself up, but the ice beneath her was starting to break apart. She could hear the creatures beneath her, their movement growing faster, more frantic, as if they were closing in. A deep, guttural sound vibrated from below, a voice not spoken, but felt, resonating through the ice. "You shouldn't have gone." And in a split second, Sarah was plunged into the freezing water. The world went black as she was dragged down, the cold like fire in her veins. The last thing she saw was the countless eyes watching her, glowing beneath the surface of the lake. When Sarah's body was recovered days later, the townsfolk spoke in quiet voices about the girl who had dared to venture too close to the lake. They said the ice had cracked open to claim her, as it had claimed many others before her. And as the winter settled in, the ice remained still, its surface clear once more. But for those who looked closely, the eyes were there, lurking just beneath, watching, waiting. Story 4. The town of Hollow Grove sat on the edge of a dense, fog-covered marshland. For generations the townsfolk had lived in its shadow, aware of the strange and unexplainable happenings that often plagued their community. The fog, thick and suffocating, rolled in without warning, shrouding the town in an oppressive silence. It wasn't uncommon for people to disappear during the fog's arrival. Some simply vanished, while others were found weeks later, wandering the streets, confused and disoriented. Unable to recall where they'd been, no one dared venture into the marsh when the fog rolled in, for there were whispers, dark tales of a figure known only as the Keeper. The stories painted him as a guardian of sorts, though his protection was far from comforting. It was said that anyone who crossed the boundary of the fog and entered the marsh would encounter him. A tall, gaunt figure draped in a tattered cloak, his face hidden beneath a hood. Some claimed he had no face at all. Others said his eyes were black as midnight, burning with an otherworldly intensity. Clara Thompson, an ambitious journalist from the city, had heard the rumors of Hollow Grove and the enigmatic fog. Intrigued, she arrived one autumn afternoon, hoping to uncover the truth behind the mysterious disappearances. The town was quiet, its streets eerily empty, as if the fog had already begun to settle in. Clara found the local inn and checked in, eager to start her investigation the next morning. That night, as she sat in her room, she noticed the fog creeping in from the marsh, rolling over the town like a living thing. The air grew thick, and the distant sound of trees creaking in the wind reached her ears. The mist pressed against the windows, blocking her view of the outside world. It was then that Clara heard it, a faint knock at her door. Hesitant, she stood and opened it, but there was no one there. Only the thick, damp fog seemed to pour in, wrapping itself around her feet. She stepped outside, the chill of the mist biting at her skin. She could barely see a few feet in front of her, the fog so dense that the world beyond seemed to disappear. She felt a pull, as if something was drawing her toward the marsh. Clara hesitated for a moment, the rational part of her mind telling her to go back inside, but curiosity got the better of her. She followed the pull, her footsteps muffled by the thick fog. As she made her way toward the marsh, the mist grew heavier, swirling around her like fingers grasping at her ankles. The trees along the path loomed like dark sentinels, their twisted branches reaching toward the sky. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant croak of a frog. Clara soon found herself at the edge of the marsh, the water dark and still, the fog hovering just above its surface. And there, standing in the center of the mist, was a figure, tall and thin, draped in a cloak that seemed to blend with the fog itself. The figure's face was hidden in shadow. Clara's heart raced, her instinct screaming at her to turn and flee, but something held her in place, an overwhelming compulsion to move forward, to approach the figure. The figure did not move, but Clara felt the weight of its gaze upon her, cold and penetrating. As she drew closer, the fog parted slightly, revealing a faint glimmer of light reflecting off the still water. For a moment, Clara thought she saw something in the water, a shape, twisting and writhing beneath the surface, its eyes glowing in the darkness. But when she blinked, it was gone. The figure in the cloak lifted its hands slowly, pointing toward the water. Clara's breath caught in her throat. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her foot sinking into the soft, muddy earth of the marsh. The figure did not speak, but Clara felt a whisper in her mind, a cold, distant voice that seemed to come from the depths of the fog. "Look and see." Clara knelt beside the water, her reflection rippling across the surface. But as she gazed into the dark water, the reflection began to change. The figure standing behind her in the fog was no longer just a man in a cloak. It was something else. His face, or rather, the lack of it, became clear. There was no skin, no eyes, just a hollow void where his face should have been, a swirling vortex of darkness that seemed to draw everything into it. Clara stumbled back, her breath quickening in panic. The air around her grew colder, and the fog thickened, swirling around her like a storm. "Leave this place," the voice whispered again, more insistent this time. Clara turned to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was frozen in place, unable to move. The figure in the cloak began to approach, his steps soundless on the soft earth, the darkness of his face pulling at her very soul. "You should not have come," he hissed, his voice like the creak of ancient wood. Clara's heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in her ears. The ground beneath her feet seemed to shift, the earth becoming soft and slippery, pulling at her as if it were alive. The water of the marsh began to rise, inch by inch, until it was level with her knees. The figure stopped in front of her, his hollow face staring down at her, a void that threatened to swallow her whole. "You have seen what you should not," he said. "Now you are mine." With a sudden, violent movement, Clara was dragged into the water, the cold grip of the marsh claiming her. Her screams were swallowed by the fog as she was pulled deeper, the water closing over her head. The last thing she saw before the darkness consumed her was the glowing eyes of the figure, watching from the surface of the water. Weeks later, the townsfolk of Hollow Grove gathered to search for Clara, but all they found were her belongings, scattered at the edge of the marsh, her camera still recording, capturing only the sound of the wind and the rustling fog. The keeper of the fog had claimed another soul. Story 5. On the outskirts of a forgotten town, hidden beneath a canopy of twisted trees and shrouded in a permanent fog, lay Crow Haven, a cemetery long abandoned and overrun by nature. The gravestones were cracked and weathered, their inscriptions faded by time, and the iron gates were rusted shut. Few ventured near it, as the locals told tales of strange happenings within its boundaries. They spoke of whispers in the wind, the sound of footsteps behind you when no one was there, and most chilling of all, the shadowy figures that seemed to move through the fog, watching from the corners of your vision. Nora Winters, an investigative journalist from the city, was drawn to Crow Haven, not by the legends, but by an old photograph she had come across in her research. It showed a group of people standing before the cemetery gates, smiling in front of the tombstones. But one person in the photograph was different. The man standing at the back, his face barely visible. His eyes, however, were unmistakable, black as coal, hollow, and full of malice. She couldn't shake the feeling that the photograph held a deeper story, one that had been buried for too long. Armed with nothing but her camera, a flashlight, and her unshakable curiosity, Nora drove into the desolate town. The streets were empty, the buildings abandoned, as if the town itself had been forgotten by time. It wasn't until she reached the edge of Crow Haven that a sense of unease settled in her chest. The cemetery loomed in the distance, the silhouette of the ancient trees and crumbling gravestones barely visible through the thick fog. She parked her car and approached the gates, her breath misting in the cold air. As she pushed against the rusted iron, the gates creaked open with a loud groan, revealing a forgotten resting place. The moment she stepped inside, the temperature dropped, the chill of the cemetery seeping into her bones. It was quiet, unnaturally quiet, as if the very air held its breath. Nora snapped photos of the gravestones, each one more worn than the last, their inscriptions barely readable. The further she ventured, the heavier the atmosphere became, the air thick with the weight of something unseen, something watching. She felt it before she heard it, a soft rustling in the distance, like the sound of leaves scraping against the ground. But there were no leaves here, only the overgrown grass that swallowed the path. Nora turned quickly, her flashlight beam cutting through the fog. Nothing. She exhaled sharply, shaking off the uneasy feeling. But then the whispering started. It was faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves, but it grew louder, more distinct, until she could make out actual words. "Leave now before it's too late." The voice was soft, but it carried a weight, a warning that resonated deep in her chest. Nora glanced around, but there was no one in sight. The whispers came from all directions now, like 100 voices speaking at once, urging her to leave, to turn back. They're watching you? Nora's pulse quickened. She tried to calm herself, rationalizing that it was just the wind, just the isolation playing tricks on her mind. But the whispers continued, growing more frantic, more insistent. He's coming for you. The hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She swung her camera up, aiming it in the direction of the sound, and snapped a photo. The flash illuminated the cemetery for a moment, casting long, twisted shadows across the gravestones. In the photo, standing in the distance near a large, broken monument, was the man from the photograph. The one with the black eyes, Nora's breath caught in her throat. The figure wasn't supposed to be there. He couldn't be. She was alone, wasn't she? But when she turned to look, he was gone. Panic surged through her chest. She turned on her heel, ready to flee. But something stopped her. A heavy presence. Something intangible, pressing against her from all sides. A low, guttural growl rumbled in the distance, and the fog shifted, closing in around her. "You shouldn't have come." A voice whispered in her ear, as cold as death itself. Nora spun around, her flashlight darting through the thick mist, but she saw nothing. The growl returned, louder this time, and with it came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving through the cemetery. She backed away, the grass beneath her feet crackling, as though the ground itself was alive. Her eyes scanned the gravestones, but the fog was thick now, swallowing the world whole. "Leave, before it's too late." The voice, a chorus of whispers, came from every direction. Nora's breath was ragged, her heart pounding in her chest as she stumbled backward. But then she saw it. The man. He was standing near one of the gravestones, watching her with those hollow black eyes. He didn't move, but his presence was overwhelming, suffocating. He was closer now, much closer, though she hadn't seen him approach. She froze, her legs trembling beneath her. "You shouldn't have come," he repeated, his voice low and menacing, as if it came from the very ground itself. Nora turned to run, but the fog closed in around her like a wall. The growl grew louder, closer, and then the shadowy figures appeared, emerging from the mist, their forms indistinct, but their presence undeniable. They were watching her, waiting. The man stepped forward, his face still hidden beneath the shadows of his hood. "You're ours now," he said. The last thing Nora saw before everything went black were the hollow eyes of the man, burning with darkness, and the faces that moved behind him. Dozens of twisted, contorted faces, all staring at her. The next morning, the townsfolk found Nora's car parked outside the cemetery. But when they ventured in to search for her, there was no sign of her anywhere. Her camera was found on the ground near the gates, the lens cracked, but when they reviewed the photos, they found only one image. The same figure with the black eyes, standing alone in the center of the cemetery, his face fully visible now. But the eyes, they were no longer black, they were empty, hollow, and in the reflection of his gaze, you could see Nora's face, twisted in terror, staring back from the shadows. The fog never lifted. Story 6. In a small village of Black Hollow, nestled deep in the hills, there was a legend about a lantern that appeared only during the most violent storms. The locals whispered that it was not a mere light, but a harbinger, a signal of doom. The lantern was said to appear on the narrow, treacherous path that led to the old church, now abandoned for decades. Those who saw it were never seen again, their fates forever linked to the storm. Over the years, the villagers had learned to avoid the path when the storm clouds gathered, especially at night. The storm was coming, and with it the lantern. Ava Daniels, a writer from the city, had come to Black Hollow to escape the stress of her busy life. She had heard the rumors, of course. The village was known for its strange happenings and its weathered tales. But Ava was no believer in legends. She was a woman of reason, of logic, and the idea of a cursed lantern was nothing more than a story to her. As the days passed, the weather began to shift. The winds picked up, and a storm front moved in, cloaking the village in a heavy mist. The villagers hurried indoors, securing their homes against the coming storm. Ava, however, was intrigued. She had come to Black Hollow to find inspiration for her next novel, and this storm was just the kind of atmospheric event she needed. She stood at the window of a rented cottage, watching the sky darken, the clouds swirling ominously above. There was something mesmerizing about the storm. It called to her as the wind howled and the rain began to lash against the window pane. Ava grabbed her coat and headed out into the night. The path to the old church was overgrown with thick vines, and the trees arched high above, their gnarled limbs reaching out like twisted fingers. The storm had intensified, and the rain came in sheets, drenching her within moments. But Ava pressed on, the sound of the wind drowning out all other noise. The village behind her seemed distant now, as though it were fading into the mist. She had heard the story of the lantern from the villagers, of course, but she didn't believe in it. She simply wanted to see the church, to experience the full force of the storm. As she walked deeper into the woods, she began to feel a sense of unease. The air grew colder, and the trees seemed to close in around her. The wind carried a strange, haunting melody, like the distant ringing of a bell. It was then that she saw it. At the far end of the path, near the old church, a soft, flickering light appeared. At first, Ava thought it was the reflection of a nearby lantern, but as she drew closer, she realized it was something far different. The light was moving. It was a lantern, glowing with a pale, eerie flame that seemed to shift and twist in the wind. It swayed back and forth, casting long, twisting shadows along the overgrown path. Ava's heart skipped a beat. The stories were true, but who would be out here in such a storm? She approached cautiously, the light beckoning her, drawing her closer, despite her growing sense of dread. As she neared the church, the lantern's flame flickered again, casting an unsettling glow on the old stone walls. The air around her seemed to thicken, heavy with an unnatural silence. The wind had stopped, the rain falling in a perfect stillness. The lantern was now just a few feet away, its light bright but cold. There was no one holding it. It floated, suspended in the air, swaying gently as if rocked by an unseen hand. Ava reached out, her fingers trembling as she extended them toward the lantern. But before she could touch it, the wind howled again, and the light flickered violently. The lantern swung back and forth, casting eerie shadows that seemed to twist and move on their own. Ava stumbled back, her heart racing. She could hear something now, a soft whisper carried on the wind. Though the words were unintelligible, the whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they were all around her, filling the air. Turn back. Leave. It's not your time. Ava's breath caught in her throat. Her legs felt weak, her mind reeling. She turned to run, but the path before her had vanished. The woods were no longer familiar, and the storm had grown even more violent, the wind whipping around her like a living thing. The trees seemed to move, bending and twisting as though reaching for her. The lantern, still floating in midair, glowed brighter now, casting an eerie, almost hypnotic light. Stay. The whispers crooned, 1,000 voices speaking as one. You're part of it now. Ava's panic surged. She tried to take a step forward, but her feet felt as though they were sinking into the earth. The ground beneath her seemed to shift, becoming soft and unstable, like the very soil had turned to quicksand. She pulled her feet free, but as she looked around, the forest had changed. The trees were no longer old and twisted. They were skeletal, their bark peeling away to reveal dark, hollow trunks. The sky above was no longer stormy, but a deep, starless black. The lantern's glow intensified, and suddenly it was not alone. Dozens of lanterns appeared in the distance, flickering in the darkness, their pale flames casting long, twisting shadows. Ava looked around in horror, realizing that she was surrounded. The whispering voices had grown louder, a chorus of torment, all urging her to stay, to accept her fate. "You belong to the storm now," they whispered. "You will never leave." The ground trembled beneath her, and the trees began to bend toward her, their branches stretching out like the fingers of a monstrous hand. Ava's heart hammered in her chest as she turned to run, but the storm was closing in, the lanterns flickering out one by one, and the dark shapes that had once been trees were now moving toward her, their twisted limbs reaching for her. As she ran, her feet caught on the shifting ground, and she fell, her body sinking into the earth. She screamed, but her voice was swallowed by the storm. The last thing she saw was the flickering light of the lantern, drawing her down into the darkness. The storm raged on, and when the villagers came to search for Ava the next morning, they found nothing. Only the old church, standing in the center of the now quiet woods, and a single lantern swaying in the breeze. The whispers had gone silent, but they would return, and with them, the lantern would always beckon. Story 7. Beneath the sleepy town of Mill Creek, hidden beneath the rolling hills and quiet streets, was a network of tunnels that had been long forgotten. The townspeople knew little of their existence, and those who did spoke only in hushed tones. They were the remnants of an old mining operation, abandoned after the veins of gold ran dry. Over time, the tunnels had been sealed off, but some said they had never been fully closed, that the darkness within still beckoned. Jeremy Jacobs, a historian with a particular interest in local legends, had come to Mill Creek on a whim. His curiosity had been piqued when he stumbled across an old newspaper article about the town's strange history, and it wasn't long before he was convinced that there was more to Mill Creek than met the eye. The town, with its unassuming charm, had an air of mystery to it, a sense that the past had never really left. He had heard the rumors about the tunnels, of course. People whispered about strange noises at night, about the occasional disappearance of a townsperson. But Jeremy, ever the skeptic, dismissed these as exaggerations. He had been to plenty of towns with similar tales, stories that had been blown out of proportion over time. Still, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that there was something to these rumors. He had done his research and found records of the tunnels, descriptions of the labyrinthine passages that snaked beneath the town. It was said that the miners, desperate and driven by greed, had dug too deep, and something had been uncovered in the depths. Some said it was a curse, others said it was something far worse, a creature, a thing that had followed the miners to the surface. Whatever it was, it had been sealed away, and the town had tried to forget it. But Jeremy wasn't one to believe in curses or superstitions. He had to see for himself. Late one evening, after the sun had set and the town had gone quiet, Jeremy made his way to the old mill on the edge of town. The mill was no longer in use, its wooden frame rotting away in the damp air. It was said that the tunnels started beneath the mill, though no one knew exactly where. As he approached the structure, the air grew colder, the night growing thicker around him. The moon hung low, casting eerie shadows on the broken windows. He stood at the edge of the mill for a moment, listening to the wind whisper through the trees. There was no sound, except for the occasional rustle of leaves, but a strange unease settled over him. He couldn't explain why, but something about the place felt wrong. Ignoring the nagging feeling in his gut, Jeremy crouched down by the old wooden foundation of the mill and began to dig. It wasn't long before his shovel struck something solid. Stone. He had found it. The entrance. With his heart pounding in his chest, he cleared away the dirt and debris, revealing a narrow stone doorway, just wide enough for him to squeeze through. The air that rushed from the opening was cold and stale, like it had been trapped down there for years. He hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The tunnels were dark, and the air was thick with dust. The walls were rough-hewn stone, covered in patches of moss, and the floor was uneven, littered with debris from the long-forgotten miners. Jeremy's flashlight illuminated the narrow passageway, revealing more tunnels branching off in every direction. He had no map, no way of knowing where to go, but his instincts urged him forward. As he ventured deeper into the tunnels, the air grew colder still, and the silence around him became deafening. It was as if the world above had been swallowed by the earth, leaving only this oppressive darkness behind. The deeper he went, the more disoriented he became. The tunnels seemed to stretch on forever, twisting and turning in ways that didn't make sense. He began to wonder if he had made a mistake, if he should turn back. But then he heard it. The faint sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnel. At first, he thought it was his own, the sound of his boots scraping against the stone floor. But as he stopped to listen, the footsteps continued, moving faster, closer. His heart began to race. "Hello?" he called into the darkness, his voice barely a whisper. There was no response. The footsteps continued, now unmistakably behind him. He turned quickly, shining his flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing. The passageway was empty. He swallowed hard, his breath shallow. Something was wrong. He began to walk faster, his footsteps echoing off the walls. But no matter how fast he moved, the footsteps behind him kept pace. Is this someone or something was following him, mimicking his every movement? Panic set in as Jeremy quickened his pace, but so did the footsteps. His pulse thundered in his ears, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He turned another corner, desperate to escape the noise, but it only grew louder. "Who was there?" he shouted into the dark. No response. Anew he heard a sound, a low, guttural growl. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. He wasn't alone down here. Something else was in the tunnels. He ran now, his footsteps pounding against the stone. But no matter how fast he moved, he couldn't outrun the sound of the growl. The footsteps. They were closing in. The tunnel seemed to stretch on endlessly, the walls narrowing as he pushed forward. His flashlight flickered, casting wild shadows along the stone walls. "Get out," a voice whispered, barely audible, over the sound of his frantic breathing. It wasn't a voice he recognized, but it was clear, full of warning. "You shouldn't have come."
Rainfall.
Eerie. The growl echoed through the tunnel, louder now, unmistakable. The air grew thick, suffocating, as if the very walls of the tunnel were closing in on him. His flashlight flickered once more before dying completely, plunging him into complete darkness. He could hear the footsteps now, slow and deliberate, moving toward him. He felt a breath on his neck, the presence of something there, just behind him. Without thinking, he ran, but no matter how fast he went, the footsteps were always there, always close. The darkness seemed to swallow him whole, the walls pressing in tighter with every passing moment. He could feel it, feel the presence, whatever it was getting closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the footsteps stopped. The growl was gone. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jeremy stopped, his chest heaving, his body trembling. He dared not move, afraid of what might happen if he did. The only sound now was his own heartbeat, pounding in his ears. It wasn't until he looked around, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, and he saw it. On the walls of the tunnel, written in what appeared to be blood, were the words, "Leave now, or you will stay forever." Jeremy didn't need to be told twice. He turned and ran, blindly, through the tunnels. But as he ran, he felt the ground give way beneath him, the tunnel shifting. The walls closed in, and then everything went black. When the townspeople went searching for him, they found nothing. No sign of his flashlight, no trace of his footprints. Only the tunnels, silent, empty, and waiting for the next soul to wander in. Story 8. The old farmhouse sat at the edge of a forgotten town, its silhouette barely visible against the pale light of the harvest moon. It had stood there for generations, weathered and battered by time, its windows dark and empty. For years, the townspeople had whispered about it, about the family who once lived there, and about the night that had changed everything. But no one dared to speak of it openly, not since that fateful harvest night. The house was cursed, they said, haunted by the memories of a tragedy that had never truly passed. Jack Turner, a young journalist with a passion for uncovering mysteries, had heard the rumors during his stay in the town. He was no stranger to ghost stories and urban legends, and he had a habit of digging deeper than most. The Harvest Moon house, with its haunting history, had caught his attention the moment he arrived. There were stories, tales of a family that had disappeared without a trace, of strange occurrences that surrounded the house. And what had happened on that harvest night? It was a mystery no one seemed eager to solve. Most people avoided the house, even during the day, as if the very air around it carried a threat. But Jack was determined to uncover the truth. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and the harvest moon began to rise, Jack made his way to the house. He stood before it for a moment, taking in the sight. The house was grand once, but now its walls sagged and cracked, its door hanging crooked on its hinges. The garden had long since overgrown, wild ivy creeping up the stone walls, hiding the windows from view. There was no sound except for the soft rustling of the wind through the trees, but there was something about the air, a heaviness, a tension, that made Jack uneasy. But he pushed aside the feeling, stepping up onto the porch. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the smell of damp wood and decay greeted him. The interior of the house was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. Dust hung thick in the air, and the floorboards groaned under his weight as he stepped inside. He turned on his flashlight, casting long shadows across the room. It looked like any abandoned house. Furniture left behind, covered in layers of dust, faded photographs on the walls. But there was something off about it, something that made his skin crawl. He moved through the house slowly, snapping photos as he went. He could feel the weight of the past pressing in on him, the oppressive silence broken only by the creak of the old house. It felt as though the walls were watching him, as though something was waiting for him to make a mistake. As he explored deeper into the house, he found something that stopped him cold. A staircase leading down into the basement. The air grew colder as he descended, the silence more oppressive. When he reached the bottom, his flashlight flickered, the light dancing on the stone walls. The basement was small, and yet it felt infinite. The air was thick with the smell of earth and rot, and in the corner of the room, Jack noticed something strange. A dark stain on the floor, as if something had been spilled long ago and never cleaned up. He stepped closer, his heartbeat quickening. The stain was still fresh, its dark red color standing out against the pale wood of the floor. It had a strange metallic scent to it, and Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of dread wash over him. It wasn't blood, but it sure looked like it. Jack knelt down, reaching out to touch the stain, but before he could, the floor beneath him groaned. He pulled his hand back, his heart racing as the temperature in the room dropped. He could hear it now, a faint whisper, almost like a voice, coming from the corner of the room. "Leave." The voice was faint, but unmistakable. Jack stood frozen for a moment, his breath shallow, his body tense. Then, without thinking, he bolted up the stairs, his flashlight flickering erratically as he ascended. As he reached the top of the stairs, he saw something in the hallway. Shadows, moving. The door at the end of the hall was slightly ajar, and through the gap, Jack could just make out a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, its outline faint but distinct. It had the shape of a man, but something was wrong. Its features were blurred, as though they couldn't quite form. Jack's throat tightened, and for a moment, he couldn't move. Then, without thinking, he ran. He burst through the door, out into the yard, and into the night, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The moon was high in the sky, casting an eerie light over the house. He turned back once, just for a moment, but the figure was gone. He didn't stop running until he reached the town, his heart still pounding. He didn't go back to the Harvest Moon house. Not that night. The next day, Jack returned to the town's library, determined to learn more about the house's history. He scoured the old newspapers, reading about the Turner family who had once lived in the house. The parents, Thomas and Evelyn, and their 2 children, Elizabeth and David. The family had been well liked in the town, but one night, they had vanished without a trace. The police had never found any evidence of what had happened, but the town had changed after that. People whispered that the family had been cursed, that they had angered something that lived beneath the earth. Jack spent hours reading, piecing together the details. He found a particularly chilling article that detailed a strange occurrence on the night the family disappeared. The harvest moon had risen, and that night the family had been preparing for their annual harvest feast. But when the town arrived at the house to celebrate, they found the door locked, and there was no sign of the family. The only clue was a note left behind: "We are going to the fields. Don't follow." It was the last anyone had heard from the Turners. Over the years, there had been rumors of people seeing figures in the windows, of strange sounds coming from the house at night. Some said the family had never left, that they were still there, trapped in the house, waiting for someone to come and join them. Jack shuddered at the thought. He couldn't explain what he had seen, what he had heard, but the figure, the whispers, they had been real. There was something in that house, something ancient and hungry. That night, as Jack lay in his bed, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The air in his room grew heavy. The shadows on the walls shifted. He heard the whispers again, faint at first, then louder, as if they were coming from right outside his window. "You came. Now you stay." He shot up, his heart racing, but there was nothing there. No shadows, no figure, only the darkness creeping closer. The whispers continued. "The harvest is complete." Story 9. The Blackwood Bridge stood at the edge of the forest, its dark wooden beams stretching over the chasm like an ancient sentinel. It was a place few people dared to visit after dusk, for the bridge had a reputation that spanned generations. They said it was cursed, that anyone who crossed it under the light of the full moon would never return. Most of the townspeople avoided it, telling stories of strange sounds that echoed from the bridge at night, the soft cries of those who had disappeared. But to Adam Harris, the bridge was just another town legend, until he set foot on it himself. Adam, a seasoned hiker and photographer, had come to Blackwood to escape the chaos of the city. The small town had a charm to it. Quaint streets, old houses, and a peaceful atmosphere. It felt like a distant memory from a simpler time. When Adam arrived, he quickly heard the whispers about the Blackwood Bridge, the eerie tales that surrounded it. At first he dismissed them as local superstition, but the curiosity gnawed at him. He had a reputation for debunking myths, for finding the truth behind the rumors. The bridge was calling to him, and he couldn't resist. It was a warm evening when Adam decided to visit the bridge. The sky was painted in hues of orange and purple as the sun dipped low, and the air was thick with the scent of pine and earth. The bridge sat about a mile from the town, nestled in the shadows of the dense forest. As Adam approached it, he could feel the weight of the stories hanging in the air, but he refused to let them get to it. It was just a bridge, after all. There was nothing to fear. The bridge creaked under his feet as he stepped onto it, the wood old and worn, and the ropes that supported it frayed from years of exposure to the elements. The town's warnings echoed in his mind, but he ignored them, continuing across the bridge, his camera slung over his shoulder. As he reached the center of the bridge, a gust of wind blew through the trees, making the bridge sway slightly. Adam steadied himself, taking in the view of the chasm below. The river far below was dark and still, as if it were holding its breath. There was an unnatural stillness about the place, an oppressive silence that made Adam uneasy. He had crossed many bridges in his travels, but none had felt like this. Then he heard it, the faintest sound, like a whisper on the wind. It was so soft at first that he thought it was his imagination. But as he listened, it became clearer. The whispering seemed to come from all around him, swirling through the trees and around the bridge. "Help! Don't leave!" Adam's heart skipped a beat. He stood frozen, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. The whispers grew louder, their words distorted, like they were coming from the depths of the earth itself. It was as if something was calling to him, beckoning him to stay, to listen. "Help us." Adam shook his head, trying to dispel the eerie feeling creeping up his spine. There had to be a logical explanation. Maybe it was the wind, the sound of the trees moving. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping as the sun continued to set. Shadows stretched long across the bridge, and Adam could see something moving in the corner of his vision. First, it was just a flicker, something dark, shifting along the edge of the bridge. He turned his head, his breath catching in his throat. There, at the far end of the bridge, stood a figure. A man, or at least, it looked like one. His features were indistinct, as if they were being distorted by the fading light. The figure was tall, cloaked in shadow. Standing motionless at the far end of the bridge, watching Adam. Adam's heart pounded in his chest, his breath coming in shallow gasps. His mind screamed at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. The figure didn't speak, didn't move. It simply stood there, its presence heavy, suffocating. Adam blinked, and the figure was gone. Gone as quickly as it had appeared. He exhaled sharply, his heart racing. He didn't know whether to feel relief or fear. But before he could take another step, he heard it again. A whisper. Only this time, it was closer. Turn back. The voice was unmistakable, clear as day, and it came from right behind him. He spun around, his camera falling from his shoulder. But there was nothing there, just the empty bridge, stretching into the darkness. A cold sweat covered his skin, and his mind raced. He had to get off this bridge, now. But as he turned to leave, he saw something else. A shape, dark and formless, creeping along the edge of the bridge. It was moving toward him. Fast. Adam ran, his legs carrying him as quickly as they could, his feet pounding the wooden planks. The wind howled around him, the sound of the river far below now, drowned out by the pounding of his heart in his ears. But no matter how fast he ran, the dark figure was gaining on him, its form flickering in and out of sight. He could hear its breath now, a low, guttural rasp that sent chills down his spine. "Don't go." The whisper came again, but it was no longer a warning. It was a demand. Stay. Adam's heart thudded in his chest as he neared the end of the bridge. The figure was just behind him now, its presence heavy, suffocating. He could feel its cold touch on his neck, the icy fingers brushing his skin. In that instant, he realized it wasn't just a figure. There was something more, something ancient, something that had been waiting for him, waiting for anyone to cross the bridge and be lost to it forever. With one final surge of adrenaline, Adam reached the end of the bridge and stumbled onto solid ground. He didn't stop running until he reached the safety of the town. The whispers faded behind him, but their echo lingered in his mind. The next morning, Adam found himself at the town's local diner, trying to shake off the events of the night before. He sat at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee, when the waitress came by. She noticed the look on his face, the pale color in his cheeks. She gave him a knowing smile, though there was a sadness in her eyes. "You crossed the Blackwood Bridge, didn't you?" she asked. Adam nodded, still too shaken to speak. "You're not the first," she said softly, "but you won't be the last either." As she walked away, Adam couldn't help but wonder, was the Blackwood Bridge truly cursed? Or was there something far darker at work in that forest? Something that only waited for the night to fall to reveal itself. Story 10. The Silverthorn Asylum had stood abandoned for decades, its imposing stone structure rising from the crumbling hillside like a forgotten monument to suffering. The rumors surrounding the asylum were enough to make even the bravest souls avoid its vicinity. Once a sanctuary for the mentally ill, it had transformed into a place of dark whispers and chilling accounts after its closure. They said the spirits of the patients still wandered its empty halls, trapped in an endless loop of torment. Emma, a college student studying psychology, had always been intrigued by the history of mental health institutions. When she heard about Silverthorn from a fellow student who had recently visited, she couldn't resist. She had to see it for herself. Despite the stories, Emma was skeptical. She had spent years researching mental health history, and she was sure the tales about the asylum were nothing more than exaggerated folklore. Determined to prove it, she gathered her gear, a camera, flashlight, and notebook, and set out one late afternoon, making her way up the overgrown path that led to the asylum. As the sun sank behind the horizon, the temperature dropped, the air growing heavy with the scent of damp earth and rust. The asylum loomed before her, its Gothic architecture shrouded in the twilight. Its windows were dark, the once pristine stone walls now cracked and weathered, and the iron gates at the entrance were barely hanging on their hinges. Emma hesitated for a moment, a chill crawling down her spine, but she steeled herself. She was here to uncover the truth. She pushed open the gates, which creaked loudly as if protesting her intrusion, and stepped onto the grounds. The asylum's courtyard was overgrown with weeds and creeping vines, the remnants of its former grandeur almost lost to time. The front door was slightly ajar, as if inviting her in. Emma walked through the threshold, her flashlight casting long shadows across the darkened entryway. The air inside was musty and stale, filled with the scent of old wood and dust. She paused, letting her eyes adjust to the dim light. The long corridors stretched out before her, lined with peeling wallpaper and broken glass. The place had once been grand, but now it was a decaying shell of its former self. She took a deep breath and began exploring, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. It didn't take long for Emma to notice the strange stillness that clung to the asylum. There were no sounds, no birds, no rustling of leaves, just silence. But as she ventured deeper into the building, she began to feel as though she were not alone. A sense of being watched washed over her, and every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet seemed unnaturally loud. She shook off the unease and pressed on, determined to find the truth behind the asylum's dark reputation. Her flashlight flickered, casting odd shadows on the walls. It was then that she saw it, the first sign that something was wrong. A door at the end of the hallway was slightly open, and from within she could hear faint sounds, muffled whispers. She moved toward it, heart pounding in her chest. As she got closer, the whispers grew louder, but they weren't intelligible. The words twisted in her mind, as if they were speaking in a language she couldn't understand. Her pulse quickened as she reached the door. It was slightly ajar, and with a deep breath, Emma pushed it open. The room inside was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the moon outside. But there was something else, something more unsettling. A figure stood in the center of the room, its back to her. It was tall and gaunt, its silhouette almost blending into the shadows. Its arms were stretched out to its sides, as if reaching for something. "Help us." The voice was low, guttural, barely a whisper. Emma froze, her heart racing. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure turned slowly, its face hidden in the darkness. But its eyes, she could see the eyes. They were empty, hollow, like two deep voids staring into her soul. And then, the whispers began again. This time, louder, more insistent. "Leave. Now." The room seemed to grow colder, and Emma felt a chill spread through her body. She took a step back, her mind screaming at her to run, but her legs felt like lead. The figure stepped forward, its presence growing more oppressive with each passing second. She could hear the whispers now, clearer than ever, coming from all around her. "You shouldn't have come. You're ours. Now." Panic surged through her, and with a burst of adrenaline, Emma turned and fled. She sprinted down the hall, the whispers chasing her, their voices growing louder, filling her ears. She could feel them closing in, following her, but she couldn't look back. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she rounded corners, her flashlight bouncing wildly in her hand. But no matter how fast she ran, the whispers followed, never fading, never stopping. The building seemed endless, the halls stretching on forever. She had to find an exit. "You can't escape." The voice was no longer a whisper. It was a scream. The walls seemed to shift, the hallway stretching longer and longer, twisting around her. The asylum was alive, its very structure a trap, pulling her deeper into its grip. Emma's heart pounded in her chest as she turned another corner and found herself in a small, dimly lit room. There was a window, but it was boarded up, the view outside obscured by the decaying wood. She slammed her fist against the window, her nails scraping the surface in a desperate attempt to break free. She had to get out. She had to get out. As her hand hit the window, a cold wind blew through the room, and the boards rattled. Suddenly, the whispers stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma stood frozen, her breath held in her chest. And then, in the stillness, a voice broke through. It was the same voice from before, but it was different now. Closer. "You should never have come here. You belong to us now." The words sent a wave of terror through her, and she stumbled back, her legs giving out beneath her. The door to the room slammed shut, trapping her inside. In the darkness, she could hear the soft shuffle of feet, the faint sound of breathing, and the whispers, always the whispers, coming closer. Emma tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the darkness. She was not alone in the asylum. It had claimed her. It had always been waiting for someone like her, someone curious enough to wander too far. And now, there was no escape. The Silverthorn Asylum had claimed another soul. Story 11. The dense forest of Hollow Creek had always been an enigma. To the locals, it was a place of mystery, a dark, an endless labyrinth of trees where few dared to venture. They spoke in hushed tones about the forest, warning outsiders to stay away. Strange things were said to happen there. Things that no one could quite explain. Some said it was haunted. Others believed it was cursed, but to Kyle, it was nothing more than a challenge. A seasoned hiker and adventurer, Kyle had heard the tales about the forest before, but he wasn't the type to let fear dictate his actions. He scoffed at the superstitions, eager to discover the truth for himself. One crisp autumn morning, he decided to take a solo trip into Hollow Creek. He packed his gear, a compass, flashlight, a map, and a camera, and set out from the small village that bordered the forest. The air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, and the sky above was a dull gray, as if it were forewarning him, but Kyle ignored the uneasy feeling growing in his gut. The forest loomed ahead, its dark canopy casting long shadows over the path that led into the depths. With a deep breath, Kyle stepped forward, eager to begin his journey. The deeper Kyle ventured into the woods, the quieter it became. The usual sounds of nature, birds chirping, the rustling of leaves, seemed to vanish. The silence was unnatural, oppressive even, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The trees grew taller and thicker around him, their gnarled branches twisting together to form an almost impenetrable canopy. Kyle pressed on, determined to see it through. But as the hours passed, a strange sense of unease began to creep over him. His footsteps felt heavier, the air colder, and there was something else, something lurking just beyond his sight. A presence, a watching eye. Kyle paused, his heart racing, and glanced over his shoulder, but there was nothing, just the dense, unyielding forest. He shook his head, brushing off the feeling. It was just the isolation, he told himself. Just the weight of being alone in such a vast, untouched place. He continued on, but the eerie silence persisted. His compass began to spin wildly, and the once clear trail seemed to fade into nothingness. It was as if the forest was shifting, changing around him. After hours of walking, Kyle realized he had no idea where he was. The familiar landmarks he had passed earlier were gone, replaced by more trees, more shadows, more unbroken silence. Panic slowly began to set in. He was lost. That's when he heard it, a soft whisper, so faint that he thought he had imagined it. Kyle. The sound seemed to come from every direction, the voice distant but unmistakable. Kyle's pulse quickened. He turned in place, but saw no one. Kyle. The whisper grew louder, more insistent. His name echoed through the trees, followed by a low, guttural laugh. Kyle's breath caught in his throat as the voice twisted and distorted. No longer human, he turned and ran, heart pounding, pushing through the thick underbrush as branches scraped at his skin. The forest seemed to close in around him, the trees bending toward him as if alive, reaching for him. His flashlight flickered, casting long shadows on the ground. The laughter followed him, growing louder, the voice becoming more and more distorted with each passing second. You can't escape. It was no longer a whisper. It was a growl. Kyle's legs burned with exhaustion, but he couldn't stop. The forest was alive with something dark, something ancient, something that didn't want him to leave. He stumbled over roots, his vision blurring, his mind spinning. And then, just as he was about to give in to the overwhelming terror, the forest fell silent. The voice was gone. The air was still. Kyle stopped, gasping for breath, trying to calm himself. But his relief was short-lived. Something was wrong. The trees around him no longer looked familiar. The path he had been following had disappeared. And in the distance he saw something that sent a chill down his spine. A figure, standing motionless between the trees. Its silhouette was dark, featureless, and it didn't move. Kyle froze, his eyes locked on the figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs long and unnaturally thin, and its face, if it even had one, was shrouded in shadow. He couldn't look away. It wasn't human. It was something far older, far darker, and it was watching him. As he stood there, paralyzed, the figure began to move, slowly at first, but then with a jerky, unnatural motion, as if it were stalking him. "You shouldn't have come." The voice came again, not from the figure, but from all around him, echoing through the trees. Kyle took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. He turned and ran, but the forest seemed to shift with every step he took. The trees closed in, the shadows growing deeper, and the figure was still there, following him, no matter how fast he ran. His flashlight fell from his hand, and he could no longer see the path ahead. All he could hear was the rustling of leaves, the snap of twigs underfoot, and the low, guttural voice of the creature that was chasing him. "You can't run." The figure was getting closer now, its elongated arms reaching toward him, its distorted form taking shape. Kyle's breath came in short, panicked bursts, and his legs felt like they were made of lead. He pushed through the thick underbrush, his hands tearing at branches, trying to escape the thing that was pursuing him. And then, just as he thought he couldn't go any further, he saw it. A clearing. Moonlight filtered through the trees, casting an eerie glow on the grass. He could see the edge of the forest ahead. His heart leapt in his chest as he sprinted toward it, his body screaming in pain. But when he reached the edge of the forest, he stopped dead in his tracks. The clearing wasn't a way out. It was another part of the forest, twisted and wrong. The trees in the distance were darker, their trunks gnarled and contorted. The air was thick with fog, and standing at the center of the clearing was the figure, waiting. Kyle's blood ran cold as he realized he hadn't escaped at all. He had been walking in circles, lost within the forest's grasp. The forest had claimed him. The figure began to move toward him, its limbs bending at impossible angles. And then, in a voice that sent shivers through Kyle's soul, it whispered, "Welcome home." Story 12. It had been a long week for Sarah. The stress of her high-pressure job, the relentless emails, the meetings that never seemed to end. She needed to get away. A weekend retreat was exactly what she needed to clear her mind and find some peace. So when her friend Lisa suggested a secluded cabin deep in the woods of Black Hollow, Sarah didn't hesitate. The cabin was supposed to be peaceful, isolated, perfect for escaping the chaos of her life. Sarah arrived at the cabin late in the afternoon. The drive had been longer than expected, and the roads leading up to the secluded cabin had become narrow and winding, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to close in on her from every direction. As she pulled into the gravel driveway, she noticed that the cabin was nestled at the edge of a small clearing, its weathered exterior barely visible through the thick trees. It had an old-fashioned charm to it, with a stone fireplace, a small porch with rocking chairs, and large windows that looked out over the woods. But there was something unsettling about it, something off. Sarah shrugged off the feeling and grabbed her bags from the car. She was here to relax, not to get caught up in her imagination. The inside of the cabin was rustic, cozy even, with a large stone fireplace in the living room and wooden beams stretching across the ceiling. The furniture was simple but comfortable, and the kitchen was fully stocked with everything she might need. The cabin's isolation was perfect, she thought. No distractions. Just quiet. She unpacked, set up her laptop on the small wooden desk by the window, and opened her book. But as she tried to settle into the peace and quiet, she couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Every now and then, she'd glance out the window as if expecting someone or something to be standing just beyond her view. But each time, there was nothing. The woods were silent. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the woods darkened quickly. Sarah prepared herself a simple dinner and sat down at the small wooden table. But as she ate, she began to feel an increasing sense of unease, as though she was being watched. She tried to dismiss the feeling, but it lingered, gnawing at her. She decided to go outside, to stretch her legs and get some fresh air. The night was clear, and stars above twinkled in the inky black sky. The moon cast a pale light over the clearing, and the cabin's warm glow seemed like a distant memory as she stood in the cold night air. But as Sarah turned back to the cabin, she saw something that made her freeze. In the woods, just at the edge of the clearing, there was a figure standing motionless between the trees. It was tall, its face hidden by the shadow of the forest, but Sarah could make out its outline. Long, thin arms hanging at its sides. At first, she thought it might have been a trick of the light, some shadow cast by the trees, but the figure didn't move. It just stood there watching her. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. She blinked, trying to convince herself it was nothing. But when she opened her eyes again, the figure was still there, and it was closer now. Sarah's breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. She backed toward the cabin, every instinct screaming at her to run, but her legs felt frozen to the spot. The figure was slowly advancing toward her, its movements slow and deliberate. Then, without warning, it stopped. The silence of the night seemed to stretch on forever. Sarah could barely breathe. She wanted to scream, but her voice was lodged in her throat. The figure stood still for a moment, and then, in a voice so quiet it was barely a whisper, it spoke. Sarah. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and she could feel the blood drain from her face. How could it know her name? How could it possibly know who she was? Sarah. The figure took another step forward, its long, thin limbs swaying unnaturally. Its face was still hidden in the shadows, but the voice was unmistakable. It was calling her. Sarah turned and ran for the cabin, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She slammed the door behind her and locked it, pressing her back against the cold wood. Her heart was racing and her thoughts were scattered. What was that thing? Was it real? She could hear the distant sound of footsteps outside the cabin, slow and deliberate, moving around the building. Her hand shook as she gripped the handle of the flashlight, the beam cutting through the dark room. She tried to steady her breathing, but it felt like the walls were closing in on her. She moved toward the window and cautiously peered out, the beam of the flashlight illuminating the trees. There was nothing, just the dark outline of the woods, shrouded in shadows. The footsteps had stopped, but the silence that followed was worse than any sound. It was oppressive, suffocating. Sarah took a deep breath, trying to calm herself. She had to be imagining things. There was no figure in the woods. There was no one watching her. It was all in her head. But then she heard something else. Something that made her blood run cold. The sound of scraping, like fingers dragging across wood. Slowly, deliberately. It came from the porch. Sarah's heart stopped. The figure was out there. It was on the porch now. She could hear it moving, hear the soft scrape of its hands against the wood. The door to the cabin rattled, as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. Sarah backed away from the window, her mind racing. What was it? Why was it here? She grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she dialed Lisa's number. It went straight to voicemail. Panic surged through her chest. She tried again, but the call wouldn't go through. The cabin had no cell service, she realized. She was alone. The scraping continued, louder now, as if whatever was outside was getting closer. And then, suddenly, it stopped. Dead silence. Sarah stood frozen, not daring to move. The air in the cabin felt thick, as though something was waiting for her to make the next move. And then, a knock. One single, hollow knock on the door. Sarah The voice was low, strained, almost familiar. It came from right outside the door. She had no idea how, but the figure knew her name. It knew who she was. It had been waiting for her, and before Sarah could react, the door creaked open, slowly, deliberately, and a cold gust of wind swept into the room. The darkness seemed to pour in with it. She could hear its breaths, shallow and ragged in the stillness. The door slammed shut, the noise deafening in the silence of the cabin. And just as quickly as it had started, it was over. Sarah sank to the floor, her body trembling uncontrollably. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't think. But then from the shadows of the cabin, a whisper, "You belong here now." And as the darkness closed in, Sarah realized the truth. The cabin at Black Hollow wasn't just a retreat. It was a trap, and she had walked right in. Story 13. James had always been a man of reason, a skeptic, if you will. Ghost stories, supernatural phenomena, things that went bump in the night. He didn't believe in any of it. He worked as a journalist, writing articles debunking myths, explaining away the unexplainable. But when a mysterious letter arrived at his office, sealed with a strange wax insignia, it set into motion a series of events that would shatter his understanding of reality. The letter was brief and unsettling. It simply read, "The Watcher is waiting for you. You need to see the truth." There was no return address, no signature, just a cryptic message and a strange, faded photograph of a dilapidated house nestled in the woods. On impulse, James decided to investigate. The house, according to the letter, was located at the outskirts of the town of Pine Hollow, a place he had never heard of. The town was small, almost forgotten by time. And when he arrived, it felt as though the world itself had left it behind. Pine Hollow was a place of half-abandoned buildings, streets that barely saw any foot traffic, and an eerie quietness that hung in the air. As he drove through the town, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It was as if every house, every corner, every street lamp had eyes. He shrugged off the unease as paranoia and followed the directions on the letter. The house wasn't far from town, perched at the edge of a dense forest. It stood tall, dark, and imposing. A Victorian-style mansion that had long since fallen into ruin. The windows were boarded up, the roof sagging, and the paint was chipped and peeling. There was no sign of life. The air around the house was thick, almost stifling, as if the land itself was holding its breath. James felt an inexplicable pull to the place. Something about the house felt familiar, as though he had seen it before, or perhaps dreamed of it, but he couldn't place where or when. His mind raced as he stepped closer to the front door, his footsteps muffled by the thick layer of leaves that covered the ground. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the wind. With a hesitant breath, James pushed it open and entered. The inside of the house was just as desolate as the outside. Dust covered every surface, and the air was musty, heavy with age. Broken furniture lay scattered around, the remnants of lives long forgotten. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, faded and torn in places. But there was one thing that stood out, a strange, unsettling presence in the air. It felt as though someone, or something, was watching him. The hair on the back of his neck prickled, and his heart began to race. James turned on his flashlight, the beam cutting through the thick shadows that filled the house. He moved slowly, carefully, through the rooms, searching for answers. But the deeper he ventured into the house, the more the atmosphere seemed to shift. The walls seemed to close in, and the silence grew oppressive, heavy. Every step he took was met with a strange stillness, as if the house itself was holding its breath. And then he saw it, at the end of a long hallway, just beyond the edge of his flashlight's beam. A figure stood motionless. It was tall, thin, and shrouded in darkness, with no discernible features. James froze, his pulse quickening. The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound. It just stood there, as if waiting. "Hello?" James called out, his voice trembling slightly. No response. He took a step forward, then another, but the figure didn't budge. With each step, the silence grew heavier, more suffocating, until it felt as though the air itself was thick with dread. James felt an overwhelming sense of dread creep up his spine. He should turn back. He should leave. But he couldn't. There was something compelling him to move closer, to find out what the figure was. As he approached, the figure remained still, its form blending with the shadows, almost as if it were part of the darkness itself. And then, just as he reached out to touch it, a cold, bone-chilling voice whispered in his ear. "You shouldn't have come." James recoiled, stumbling backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure hadn't moved. But the voice, it had come from within his mind, as though the house itself was speaking to him. His eyes darted around the hallway, but there was no one else. Just the dark, empty house. And then he saw it. On the walls, faint, almost invisible markings began to appear. Scratches, like claw marks, carved deep into the wood. They formed a pattern, a symbol that James couldn't recognize. It was old, ancient even, and it seemed to pulse with a dark energy. He backed away slowly, his mind racing. What was happening? What was this place? And then, as though in response to his thoughts, the figure moved. It didn't walk. It simply slid, its body shifting through the shadows like a wisp of smoke. James couldn't look away. His legs felt rooted to the spot, his body frozen with fear. The figure's head tilted slightly, as if it was studying him. "You're not supposed to be here." The voice was louder this time, and it echoed through the empty halls, reverberating in James' skull. The air grew colder, the darkness thickening around him. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished. James blinked, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked around frantically, but the hallway was empty. The oppressive silence returned, and the weight of the house seemed to lift, if only slightly. But something had changed. The air was charged, heavy with a sense of impending doom. James knew he wasn't alone. He wasn't supposed to be here. The floor beneath him groaned, and the walls creaked as though the house itself was shifting. The flashlight flickered, the beam growing weaker. And then, the door at the end of the hallway slammed shut, trapping him in the darkness. He turned to run, but the hallway stretched on impossibly long, the walls closing in, the shadows swallowing him whole. Every turn, every doorway led him further into the labyrinth of the house. The scratching on the walls grew louder, more frantic, as though something was desperately trying to get out. He could hear footsteps now, the sound of something following him. He could feel it. He could feel it, getting closer, the presence looming just behind him. And then the voice came again. "You belong to me now." The door in front of him suddenly opened, and beyond it, a vast, empty void stretched out. There was no escape. The walls were closing in. The shadows were closing in. And the figure was there, always just out of sight, waiting. James' mind snapped. the terror overwhelming him as he felt himself being drawn into the dark, his body unwillingly pulled toward the unknown. And then, as the house consumed him, he realized he was never meant to leave. The house had been waiting for him. Story 14. Eli had always been drawn to old cemeteries. There was something about them. Something quiet, serene, and eerie that intrigued him. He'd spent countless afternoons exploring them, taking photographs of weathered tombstones, deciphering the names and dates carved into the stone. For him, it was a way to connect with history, to feel the weight of the past on his shoulders. But there was one cemetery, on the outskirts of town, that had always fascinated him the most. It was a place he had heard stories about, but never dared to visit. The locals called it the Hollow Cemetery, and it was rumored to be haunted. The gravestones were older than most in the area, some of them nearly forgotten, half buried under layers of moss and ivy. But there was one grave in particular that stood out, an unmarked grave that no one seemed to know the origin of. No one knew who was buried there, or why it had no inscription. The curiosity had always gnawed at Eli, and one cold autumn evening, he finally decided to visit. As he walked through the gates of the Hollow Cemetery, the air seemed to change. The wind whispered through the trees, the branches swaying above him like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. The ground was soft beneath his boots, the fallen leaves crunching as he moved deeper into the cemetery. The place felt abandoned, forgotten by time. Yet there was an undeniable sense of presence in the air. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of damp earth, and the quiet was oppressive, almost suffocating. Eli walked past row after row of gravestones, each one worn with age, names barely legible under the grime of time. The gravestones were crooked, leaning at odd angles, as though the ground itself was shifting beneath them. But as he ventured further, his eyes were drawn to the back of the cemetery, where the trees grew thicker, their twisted branches blocking out the light. It was there that he saw it, the unmarked grave. It was nestled between two ancient oak trees, the earth disturbed as though someone had recently dug it up. The grave itself was simple, a mound of dirt with no headstone, no marker, nothing to indicate who had been buried there. It was as if the grave had been intentionally erased from history. Eli's heart raced as he approached. There was something undeniably unsettling about it. He knelt down beside the grave, running his fingers through the loose soil. His flashlight flickered in the growing darkness, casting long shadows across the surrounding graves. As he sifted through the dirt, something cold and smooth brushed against his fingers. Startled, Eli pulled his hand back, his breath quickening. What was that? He reached into the hole once more, this time more cautiously, and pulled out a small, weathered object. It was a ring, silver, with intricate carvings etched into its surface. There was something unusual about it, something unnatural. Eli examined it closely, his fingers tracing the design. It wasn't a traditional ring, not like any he had ever seen. The carvings were not symbols or patterns. They were more like words, written in a language he didn't recognize. As he held the ring up to the light, something strange began to happen. The air around him grew colder, the wind picking up, howling through the cemetery like a distant wail. Eli's heart pounded in his chest, and he stood up, a sense of unease creeping over him. The hairs on the back of his neck stood on end. Suddenly there was a sound, a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from all around him. "Leave." Eli froze. The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was there, echoing through the cemetery like a warning. He spun around, his eyes darting across the gravestones, but there was no one there. The cemetery was empty. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck prickle, a chill running down his spine. "Leave, now." The voice was louder this time, more urgent. Eli's hand gripped the ring tighter, and he turned to leave. But as he stepped away from the grave, he heard something else. something that made his blood run cold. The sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, crunching through the leaves behind him. He spun around, but there was no one there. The footsteps stopped as suddenly as they had started. His heart raced, and the air around him grew heavier, thicker. It felt as though the very ground beneath him was alive, watching him, waiting. You should not have disturbed it. The voice was no longer just a whisper. It was a low, menacing growl that seemed to come from within the earth itself. Elias' stomach churned, his hands trembling as he gripped the ring tighter. He backed away from the grave, his eyes scanning the cemetery for any sign of movement. But there was nothing, just the same eerie stillness. He needed to get out of there. Fast, he turned and ran, his boots pounding against the earth as he rushed toward the gate. The sound of footsteps followed him, always just behind him, growing louder with each step. He didn't dare look back. The wind whipped through the trees, the sound of branches creaking in the distance like the bones of the dead. The cemetery seemed to stretch endlessly before him, the path growing longer and longer, the gates just out of reach. And then, just as he thought he was about to escape, he heard it again. Louder, closer now. You cannot leave. Elias' blood ran cold. The voice was so close now, it was almost in his ear. Panic surged through him, and he stumbled, his legs giving way beneath him. He collapsed to the ground, the ring slipping from his hand and rolling into the dirt. He reached out for it, but the moment his fingers touched the earth, the ground beneath him shifted. The cemetery seemed to close in. The trees bending toward him, the gravestones leaning in as if they were alive. The air was thick, suffocating, and the voice was everywhere now. You belong here. Eli struggled to stand, but the ground seemed to pull him down. He tried to scream, but no sound came out. His body felt heavy, as though the earth was swallowing him whole. And then, as the darkness closed in, he realized the truth. The hollow cemetery was no ordinary graveyard. It was a place where the dead did not rest. It was a place where the earth itself kept secrets. Secrets that no living soul was meant to uncover. And now, Eli was one of them. Story 15. Sarah had always been fascinated by abandoned places, old factories, decaying hospitals, forgotten underground tunnels. There was a strange allure to these forgotten spaces, as if they held secrets of the past, stories untold, and histories long buried. It was this curiosity that led her to the abandoned subway station beneath the city, a place locals spoke of in hushed whispers. Rumor had it that the station had been closed for decades after a mysterious disaster, one that left the place untouched, preserved in time, and filled with an unsettling history. But for Sarah, it was just another adventure waiting to be explored. She'd heard the stories from friends, but they didn't scare her. She was used to exploring places like this, armed with a flashlight, a camera, and a notebook to document her experience. Sarah descended into the depths of the city, the entrance to the old station hidden beneath an overgrown park. As she slipped through a gap in the rusted gates, she felt the temperature drop, the air growing cooler with each step. The faint smell of mildew and decay hit her nose, but she ignored it, eager to discover what lay ahead. The station was eerily silent, the only sound the echo of her footsteps bouncing off the cracked tiles and graffiti-covered walls. Her flashlight flickered briefly before steadying, illuminating the long-forgotten platform. The tracks were coated in dust, and the trains had long since been removed, leaving only empty space. There were no signs of life here, no signs of anything recent. Just the remnants of a place that time had abandoned. Sarah took a deep breath and began snapping pictures, her camera capturing the haunting beauty of the space. It was a time capsule, frozen in a moment of decay. The walls were lined with faded advertisements for long-defunct products, and broken benches sat in forgotten corners, their wood splintered and decayed. But it wasn't just the physical decay that caught Sarah's attention. It was the feeling that lingered in the air. The oppressive, heavy silence that seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. As she walked further down the platform, she noticed something strange on the far side of the station. Beyond where the tracks disappeared into the darkness, there was a door. It was out of place, newer than the rest of the station, with a polished brass handle and no sign indicating what lay beyond. Intrigued, Sarah moved toward it, her heart beating a little faster. The door creaked as she turned the handle, the sound of it echoing through the empty station. On the other side was a staircase spiraling downward into a pitch-black abyss. A sudden rush of cold air hit her face, and for a moment, Sarah hesitated. She had always been curious, but this felt different. Something about the darkness that awaited below made her uneasy. Still, the pull of mystery was too strong, and she descended the staircase. The further she went, the darker it became, until the beam of her flashlight barely cut through the thickening shadows. She reached the bottom and found herself in a long corridor, the walls smooth and unnaturally clean compared to the station above. It was as if this part of the underground had been untouched, preserved. Sarah's flashlight flickered again, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. It was at that moment that she heard the sound. A faint, distant tapping, like fingers drumming on metal. She stopped, her breath catching in her throat. The sound seemed to come from the end of the corridor, where the darkness seemed to stretch endlessly. Sarah took a step forward, the noise growing louder with each movement. The tapping had become a rhythmic beat, like someone or something was waiting for her. Her heart raced, and she had the distinct feeling that she was being watched. But curiosity drove her forward, and with each step, the sound grew louder, clearer. And then, at the end of the corridor, she saw it, an open door. It was a stark contrast to the rest of the space, where everything was closed and still. The door was slightly ajar, revealing a room bathed in an unnatural, dim light. It was the source of the tapping. Sarah hesitated for only a moment before pushing the door open. The room was small, its walls lined with shelves and cabinets filled with strange objects. Old books, glass jars filled with what looked like strange, preserved creatures, and other items she couldn't identify. At the center of the room was a large metal table, and sitting at it was a figure, a person, hunched over and tapping their fingers against the table. They didn't seem to notice her presence. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine as she took in the sight of the figure. They were dressed in a worn, faded uniform, the kind worn by the subway workers of years past. But there was something odd about them. Their posture was wrong, their movements too jerky, too mechanical, and their face, it was hidden in shadow. Their features distorted and unnatural. "Hello." The figure didn't respond. The tapping continued, relentless and rhythmic. Sarah took a cautious step forward, her eyes fixed on the figure. She was close now, close enough to see the details of their face. But the closer she got, the more she felt as though something was terribly wrong. The figure's face was pale, almost translucent, and their eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were hollow, black voids that seemed to absorb the light around them. There was no expression on their face, no sign of recognition or life. "Are you okay?" Sarah whispered, almost afraid of the answer. But the figure didn't respond. It simply continued tapping, its fingers never stopping, never wavering. Sarah's flashlight flickered again, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to shift. The shadows grew darker, the air thicker, and the tapping became louder, more insistent. It was as though the figure was waiting for something, waiting for her to do something. And then, without warning, the figure stopped. The tapping ceased, and the room was drowned in an eerie silence. Sarah froze, her breath caught in her throat. The figure slowly turned its head to face her, its hollow eyes locking onto hers. A chill ran through her body, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. "You shouldn't be here," the figure whispered, its voice like dry paper, rasping and hollow. "You never should have come." Sarah backed away, her heart racing. The door behind her slammed shut, trapping her in the room. The figure stood up, its movements slow and deliberate, and it began to approach her. With each step, the temperature in the room dropped, the air becoming thick with the scent of decay. "You are not meant to leave." The figure's voice was louder now, filled with an unnatural malice. It reached out, its long, thin fingers stretching toward her. Sarah's pulse pounded in her ears, and she spun around, frantically trying to find a way out. But the room seemed to close in around her, the walls narrowing, the door nowhere in sight. She ran down the hallway, her flashlight flickering erratically as the sound of footsteps followed her, gaining on her with every step. She turned corner after corner, but no matter how fast she ran, the tunnel seemed to stretch on forever, the exit always just out of reach. And then the footsteps stopped. The tapping began again, this time from behind her. Sarah stopped in her tracks, unable to move. She turned slowly, and there it was, the figure standing at the end of the hallway, its hollow eyes fixed on her. The tapping grew louder, echoing in the darkness. "You cannot leave," it whispered. "You cannot leave." It whispered, "Not now. Not ever." The last thing Sarah saw was the figure stepping closer, its long fingers reaching out to claim her. And then, the world went dark. Story 16. Daniel had always been skeptical of the supernatural. He wasn't the type to believe in ghosts or curses, much less haunted places. To him, everything could be explained logically. Old houses creaking in the wind, strange noises from the pipes, or the occasional flicker of the lights. So when his friends told him about the old mansion on the outskirts of town, a place rumored to be haunted, Daniel wasn't the least bit interested. It was just another old house, forgotten by time, he thought. But when they dared him to spend the night there, something in his competitive nature stirred. He accepted the challenge, determined to prove that there was nothing to fear. The mansion, known as Blackwood Manor, it was an imposing structure, with ivy crawling up its stone walls and broken windows that seemed to stare out like empty eyes. The town's folklore said that a family had once lived there, wealthy, influential, and well-respected, until one fateful night when they all mysteriously disappeared without a trace. The house had been left abandoned ever since, its history lost to time. When Daniel arrived at the manor, the sun had just begun to set, casting long, haunting shadows across the property. The gate creaked as he pushed it open, and the air smelled of damp earth and decay. The mansion loomed ahead, its silhouette dark against the deepening sky. As he approached the front door, he couldn't help but notice the strange silence around him. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just an unsettling stillness that seemed to press in on him from all sides. He shook it off. "It's just an old house," he muttered to himself. "Nothing more." The front door was ajar, creaking on its hinges as he pushed it open. The air inside was musty, thick with the scent of mold and rot. The floor was covered in dust, the furniture draped in white sheets, as though the house had been abandoned in the middle of a life that had once been. Daniel's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing the grand interior of the manor. The walls were lined with portraits of stern-looking men and women, their eyes following him as he moved through the hallway. The staircase, grand and elegant, twisted upward into the gloom. Despite his initial confidence, a shiver ran down his spine. Something didn't feel right. He brushed it off his nerves. He moved deeper into the mansion, his footsteps echoing loudly in the emptiness. As he explored room after room, he couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't alone. He would catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye, shadows shifting when he wasn't looking directly at them. But whenever he turned his head, there was nothing there. He dismissed it as his imagination. He was determined to prove there was nothing to fear. In the parlor, he found a large, ornate mirror hanging on the wall. The glass was cracked, but it still reflected his image. As he stared at his reflection, a flicker of movement caught his eye. He turned, expecting to see something, but once again, there was nothing. Just the same empty room. But when he looked back at the mirror, his reflection was no longer the same. His face, his eyes, were hollow, dark, and empty. He froze, his heart racing. The figure in the mirror grinned, its lips curling into a twisted, malevolent smile. Daniel stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. The reflection mimicked his movements, but its grin never faded. It was as if the thing in the mirror was no longer him, but something else, something that had taken his place. He blinked and turned away. The image still burned into his mind. When he looked back at the mirror, it was normal again. His reflection was his own, but the sense of unease only deepened. Something was wrong with this place. As he ventured further into the mansion, the air grew colder. The walls seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing longer and more oppressive. The house itself seemed to be alive, shifting, creaking with the weight of centuries. He could hear faint whispers, voices, distant but clear. At first he thought it was just the wind, but then the voices began to grow louder, and they seemed to be calling his name. Daniel! The whisper came from somewhere deeper in the house. He spun around, his heart hammering in his chest, but there was no one there. Just the cold, empty hallways. He took a deep breath and pressed on, determined to reach the attic. He heard rumors that strange occurrences often happened there. Strange noises, objects moving on their own. He wanted to see for himself. The stairs to the attic creaked under his weight as he ascended, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. The door at the top of the stairs was cracked open, the faintest sliver of light spilling out from the gap. As he pushed the door open, a chill ran down his spine. The room was bathed in an eerie glow, as though the darkness itself had taken on a tangible form. The attic was cluttered with old furniture, boxes and cobwebs, but what caught his attention was the center of the room. Atop a dusty old table lay a large black box, ornate, with intricate carvings etched into its surface. The box seemed to hum with energy, a low vibration that rattled the air around it. Daniel's pulse quickened. He had to know what was inside. He approached the table slowly, his hand trembling as he reached for the box. As his fingers brushed against the surface, a jolt of cold electricity shot through him, and the whispers grew louder. Louder than before, more frantic. Daniel. The box creaked open on its own, revealing a collection of strange old artifacts, small wooden figurines, tarnished coins, and an assortment of objects that seemed to pulse with dark energy. But it wasn't the contents of the box that chilled Daniel to his core. It was the note that was tucked inside. He pulled it out, his eyes scanning the faded ink. You shouldn't have come. The house never lets go. It never forgets. A sudden crash behind him made him jump. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat. There, in the corner of the attic, stood a figure, tall, thin, with hollow eyes and a twisted smile. It was the same figure he had seen in the mirror. The figure stepped forward, its body lurching unnaturally, as if it were being dragged by some unseen force. You've disturbed us, it whispered, its voice a low, guttural growl. You'll never leave. Panic surged through Daniel's chest. He turned and bolted down the stairs, his feet stumbling as he ran through the dark hallways, the sound of footsteps following him, gaining on him with each step. The mansion seemed to close in around him, the walls shifting and warping, as if the house itself were alive. He reached the front door, but it wouldn't open. It was locked. the handle cold to the touch. He turned and looked back, but the figure was right behind him now, its hollow eyes fixed on him, its mouth stretching into a wide, twisted grin. "It's too late," the figure hissed. "The house has claimed you." In that moment, Daniel realized the truth. The mansion was alive, and it would never let him leave. The last thing he'd heard was the echo of his own scream, swallowed by the shifting shadows of Blackwood Manor. Story 17. The forest had always been a place of mystery for Charlie. He had grown up in a small town, nestled at the edge of it. And as a child, he'd often been warned to stay away from the dense woods. "There are things in there you don't want to see," his grandmother would say, her voice trembling as she spoke of the stories that had been passed down for generations. But Charlie, ever the skeptic, never believed in those tales. He dismissed them as mere folklore, nothing more than old superstitions meant to scare children. Now, as an adult, Charlie found himself drawn back to the forest. He had recently returned to his hometown after several years away, and the forest, its towering trees and thick underbrush, seemed to call to him. It was as if it had been waiting, patiently, for him to return. The first time he ventured into the woods after his return, it felt different. The air was thicker, more oppressive, and the familiar path he had walked as a child seemed unfamiliar. Overgrown and wild, the trees loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled roots twisting out of the earth like veins, stretching toward him. The once bright and vibrant forest was now dark, the canopy so dense that little sunlight made it through. Despite the unease gnawing at him, Charlie pressed on. The deeper he went into the forest, the quieter it became. There were no birds singing, no rustling of leaves in the breeze, just the suffocating silence that seemed to press in on him from all sides. He felt as though the forest was holding its breath, waiting. After what felt like hours of walking, Charlie stumbled upon an old stone foundation hidden beneath a tangle of ivy and moss. It was the remains of an old cabin, long abandoned, its walls crumbled and weathered by time. But it wasn't the ruin itself that caught Charlie's attention. It was the feeling that something had been left behind, something forgotten. A low hum seemed to resonate from beneath the ground, faint but unmistakable, as if the earth itself was alive. Charlie crouched down, running his fingers over the moss-covered stones. The hum grew louder, and his heart began to race. There was something beneath the cabin, something buried. Without thinking, he dug at the earth, his hands tearing at the soil until his fingers touched something cold and smooth. A metal object buried deep beneath the foundation. With great effort, he pried it free. It was a small, rusted box, its surface covered in strange symbols he didn't recognize. A chill ran down his spine as he turned the box over in his hands. He had no idea why, but he felt compelled to open it. The box creaked as he pried it open, revealing an old yellowed piece of paper inside. The paper was brittle, the ink faded, but he could make out the words. The silent beneath, "Do not disturb what has been buried. Do not disturb what has been buried." A sense of dread washed over him as he read the warning. But it was too late. He had already disturbed something, and he could feel it now. The weight of something watching him. The trees around him seemed to shift, their branches swaying in a wind that had no origin. The hum beneath the ground grew louder, more insistent, vibrating through his bones. Charlie stood up quickly, the box still clutched in his hands. He had to leave. The sense of wrongness in the air was palpable now, suffocating, as if the forest itself was closing in on him. He turned to leave, but the path he had come down seemed different. The trees had rearranged themselves, their trunks twisting in unnatural ways. The forest had shifted, as if it had become something else entirely. The whisper of wind in the branches became a low, guttural sound, like a voice, murmuring the language Charlie couldn't understand. Panic rose in his chest. He started to run, but the deeper he went, the more the forest seemed to stretch on endlessly, as if it were growing, expanding, trapping him. The air grew colder, and the hum beneath the earth seemed to shake the ground. He stumbled, his breath coming in short gasps as he tried to find his way back. But the woods were no longer familiar. The trees loomed like dark sentinels, their bark twisted into shapes that seemed almost human, their branches reaching out as though trying to grab him. The whispers in the wind became louder, clearer, now sounding like voices calling his name. Charlie. It was his name, but distorted, drawn out, as if coming from the very earth beneath him. He spun around, his flashlight beam cutting through the dark, but there was no one there. Just the trees, silent, still, and watching. His heart pounded in his chest as he broke into a run again. But the woods seemed to stretch endlessly before him. No matter which direction he turned, he couldn't find the path. The darkness was thick, like a tangible force that surrounded him, pressing in from all sides. Charlie. The voice came again, louder this time, closer. He turned and saw a figure in the distance, a tall, thin figure, draped in tattered rags. Its face was obscured, but Charlie could feel its eyes upon him, burning into him with an intensity that made his skin crawl. The figure stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural, as if it were being dragged through the air by some invisible force. He couldn't make out its features, but he knew it was not human. It was something else, something that had been hidden, buried beneath the forest. The hum beneath the earth reached a deafening crescendo, vibrating through the very ground beneath his feet. Charlie froze, his body paralyzed by a sudden wave of terror. The figure was almost upon him now, its shape distorting as it moved, flickering in and out of focus like a shadow caught in a storm. "You woke it," the voice said, its tone mocking, yet full of menace. If full of menace, you disturbed what should never be disturbed. The ground beneath Charlie's feet began to tremble. The trees around him began to shake violently, their branches creaking and snapping. The forest was alive, its very roots moving, shifting beneath the earth. And then, from beneath the soil, something began to emerge. Dark, twisted shapes, writhing and reaching out like tendrils. The figure was almost upon him now, its hands outstretched, its body flickering like a broken light. "You will stay with us," it hissed. "Forever," Charlie screamed as the forest closed in on him. The ground gave way beneath his feet, and he plunged into darkness, the world around him collapsing as the hum rose to a deafening roar. His body was pulled into the earth, into the silent beneath, where the buried things waited. And as the last of his scream faded into the void, he understood the truth. The forest had never been just trees and soil. It was a prison, a place where things were hidden, things that had never been meant to see the light of day. And once they were disturbed, once they were awakened, there was no escaping them. The forest would claim you, and you would stay there, beneath the silence, forever. Story 18. The town of Blythe Hollow was no stranger to storms. For as long as anyone could remember, violent tempests had swept through the region with terrifying regularity. But there was one storm that stood out in the town's history, a storm so fierce that it left a mark on the land and the people that no one could ever forget. The storm arrived without warning. Just as the sun began to set on a cool autumn evening, the sky turned an unnatural shade of green, the clouds swirling together in an almost deliberate pattern, as if something was guiding them. The wind picked up with a sudden brutal force, knocking over trees and sending debris flying through the air. The streets of Blythe Hollow emptied as the townspeople retreated into their homes, huddling together in fear. Among the town's residents was Ethan, a young man who had recently moved to Blythe Hollow in search of a quiet life away from the chaos of the city. He had always been drawn to isolated places, and when he found the small cottage on the edge of town, he knew it was the perfect place to start over. Ethan had heard the rumors about the town, about the storms that seemed to come out of nowhere, about the strange disappearances that had plagued Blythe Hollow for generations, but he had brushed them off as local folklore. He wasn't one to put stock in ghost stories and superstitions. But as the storm raged outside that night, Ethan began to feel a deep unease. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows of his cottage, and the thunder rolled in waves, shaking the very foundations of the house. The air felt thick, charged with a strange energy, as though the storm itself was alive. He tried to ignore it, convincing himself that it was just another typical storm. But then he heard it, faint at first, like a whisper carried by the wind, a soft voice, barely audible over the roar of the storm, calling his name, Ethan. He froze, his heart skipping a beat. The voice sounded so real, so close, yet when he looked around, there was no one there. The room was empty, the only light coming from the flickering candles that barely held against the wind. Ethan stood up, his breath quickening. The voice came again, louder this time. Ethan. It was unmistakable now, and it sent a shiver down his spine. He rushed to the door, throwing it open and stepping out into the storm. The wind whipped around him, almost knocking him off his feet, but he could hear it now, the sound of footsteps crunching through the wet earth. They were coming from the woods, just beyond his cottage. Ethan's mind raced. Who could be out there in this weather? He hesitated for a moment, but his curiosity got the better of him. He grabbed a lantern from the table, its flickering light barely illuminating the path before him, and stepped into the storm. The trees creaked and groaned in the wind as he made his way toward the woods. The voice, soft but insistent, continued to call his name, Ethan. It was as if the wind itself carried the sound, wrapping around him, pulling him deeper into the forest. He stumbled through the underbrush, the lantern's light casting strange, distorted shadows on the trees. The air grew colder, and the storm seemed to intensify with each step he took. His heart pounded in his chest, but he couldn't stop. Something compelled him to keep going, to follow the voice, to find the source of the footsteps that echoed around him. He was close now, closer than ever before. The wind seemed to die down for a moment, and the only sound was his own breathing and the distant rumble of thunder. He reached a clearing in the woods, and there, standing at the edge of a darkened pond, was a figure. At first, he thought it was just a shadow, but as he got closer, the figure came into focus. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by a hooded cloak. The man stood completely still, his back to Ethan, staring out at the water. Ethan called out to him, but the man didn't respond. The voice that had been calling his name was gone now, replaced by an oppressive silence. The air felt heavy, thick with something he couldn't quite name. He took a step forward, and then another, but as he did, the figure turned, revealing its face. Ethan froze. The man's face was pale, almost ghostly, and his eyes were hollow, empty voids where nothing could be seen. His mouth was a thin, twisted line, and his skin hung loosely from his bones, as though he had been dead for years. The man's gaze locked onto Ethan's, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. A low, guttural whisper filled the air. "You shouldn't have come." Ethan took a step back, his heart racing. His body screamed for him to run, to escape the suffocating presence of the man, but he couldn't move. The figure took a slow step toward him, its footsteps soundless against the wet ground. "You've awoken the Watcher," the figure said, its voice barely above a whisper. "And now you belong to the storm." The words sent a cold shiver down Ethan's spine, and he finally found the strength to turn and run. He sprinted through the woods, his heart pounding in his ears. But the storm had changed. The wind howled like a living thing, and the trees seemed to bend and twist, their branches reaching out as though trying to grab him. The earth beneath his feet shifted, as though the very ground was trying to swallow him whole. The figure was behind him, its footsteps growing louder with each passing second. "You can't escape," the voice echoed through the trees. "You are part of the storm now." Ethan pushed himself harder, the darkness closing in around him. He could hear the sound of the figure's footsteps behind him, growing faster, closer. But no matter how fast he ran, he couldn't outrun it. The storm was everywhere now. The wind was a living, breathing force, pushing him forward, forcing him to move. The trees loomed like giants, their limbs swaying in the tempest, their shadows shifting unnaturally. Ethan stumbled, his foot catching on a root, and he fell to the ground with a crash. His lantern rolled away, its light flickering out as it came to a stop. He scrambled to his feet, but the storm was everywhere. The wind howled in his ears, the trees creaked and groaned, and the ground seemed to shift beneath him. He turned to face the figure, but it was gone. The forest was empty. The storm had subsided, the wind dying down, and the only sound was the distant rumble of thunder. Ethan stood alone in the clearing, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The storm was over, but the air felt thick with an unnatural heaviness. As he turned to leave, he realized that the woods were no longer the same. The path that had led him into the forest was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of trees. And then, from the distance, he heard it once more. The voice, faint but unmistakable. Ethan. It was calling him again, this time from deeper in the forest. And Ethan knew with a sinking feeling in his chest that he would never escape. The storm had claimed him, and he would forever be its prisoner. The watcher in the storm was always waiting, and now Ethan was part of it. Story 19. The small town of Blackstone Ridge was known for its isolation. Perched atop a jagged hill that overlooked miles of dense wilderness, there was something undeniably eerie about the place. A quiet that seemed to weigh heavily on the shoulders of its few residents. Some said it was the lingering presence of the old mansion at the ridge's edge, long abandoned, but still a part of the town's history. For years, the mansion had stood like a dark sentinel, its windows like hollow eyes staring out over the town below. The local children dared each other to sneak into the mansion on dark nights, but none ever ventured far. The stories of strange happenings within its walls were enough to deter even the bravest. Margaret had grown up in Blackstone Ridge, but she had never paid much attention to the tales surrounding the mansion. She had heard the whispers, of course, the old stories about the family that once lived there, the strange disappearances, the rumors of a curse that hung over the place. But Margaret wasn't one for ghost stories. She'd always believed that the mansion was just an old house, forgotten by time. But when she returned to Blackstone Ridge as an adult, after years away, something about the place felt different. It was late autumn, the wind cold and biting, and the air was thick with the scent of damp leaves. Margaret had inherited her father's old home, and when she arrived, the house was as empty as she remembered. She spent the first few days settling in, going through the motions of unpacking and cleaning. But despite the comfort of being back in her childhood home, there was a strange sense of unease in the air. One evening, after a long day of sorting through old boxes, Margaret decided to take a walk. She found herself heading toward the ridge, the mansion's silhouette looming in the distance, framed by the setting sun. Her feet carried her to the old iron gate that marked the entrance to the property. The mansion stood behind it, a crumbling monument to a time long past. The gate creaked as she pushed it open, stepping onto the grounds. The overgrown grass rustled in the wind, and the trees surrounding the mansion seemed to sway in time with the breeze, their branches casting long, twisting shadows on the ground. As Margaret walked closer, She could feel the weight of the place pressing in on her. The mansion seemed to be watching her, its windows dark and empty. She hesitated for a moment, an instinctual pull urging her to turn back, but her curiosity won out. She reached the front door and pushed it open. The door groaned, reluctant to let her in, but it gave way, and Margaret stepped inside. The air inside was thick with dust, the floorboards creaking beneath her feet. She couldn't help but feel a chill creep up her spine as she moved further into the foyer. The mansion was silent, save for the occasional groan of the walls. It was a grand place once, but now it felt hollow, like an abandoned shell. The chandeliers hung like forgotten relics, their crystals catching the dim light that filtered through the dirty windows. The walls were adorned with faded portraits of people Margaret didn't recognize, their eyes seeming to follow her every move. She wandered through the mansion, room after room, the feeling of being watched growing stronger with each step. There was something unsettling about the silence, as though the house itself was holding its breath. And then she heard it, a soft thud, like a door opening somewhere in the house. Margaret froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound was distant, but unmistakable. Someone else was in the house. She slowly turned, her breath catching in her throat, but there was no one in sight. The mansion was as empty as it had been when she first arrived, yet the air was thick with the sensation of another presence. Margaret's pulse quickened as she ventured deeper into the house, following the sound of the footsteps that now echoed in the distance. It was almost as if they were moving just ahead of her, leading her somewhere. She turned a corner, and there, at the end of the hallway, was a door slightly ajar. The sound of movement came from behind it. Margaret's hand trembled as she reached for the door, pushing it open slowly. Inside, the room was shrouded in darkness, but the faintest glimmer of light seeped in from the cracked window. The room was empty, save for a large, ornate mirror on the far wall. Margaret felt an overwhelming urge to step closer. As she approached, she noticed something strange. The reflection in the mirror was not her own. Instead, it was a figure, a tall, dark silhouette standing behind her. Margaret spun around, but there was no one there. She turned back to the mirror, and the figure in the reflection remained, its features obscured in shadow. The silence in the room seemed to grow, thickening around her, until it became suffocating. Margaret could feel her heartbeat in her throat, her breath shallow and fast. The figure in the mirror began to move, slowly at first, its hands reaching out. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She took a step back, her hand brushing against the cold surface of the mirror. The figure's hand was now inches away from hers, its dark eyes locked onto hers through the glass. Suddenly, the figure's face contorted into a grotesque expression, its mouth opening wide as if to scream. But no sound came. The silence was broken only by the sound of Margaret's own frantic breathing. The figure in the mirror raised its hand to touch the glass, and Margaret felt an icy coldness seep through her skin, as if the mirror itself had reached out to claim her. She yanked her hand back, stumbling away from the mirror, and the figure's reflection slowly faded into the darkness. Trembling, Margaret ran out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest. The house felt different now, as if it were alive, watching her every move. She bolted out of the mansion, back into the cold night air, her legs shaking beneath her. But as she looked back at the mansion, she saw it, a figure standing in one of the upper windows, staring down at her. It was too far away for her to make out any details, but she could feel its gaze piercing through the darkness. The figure did not move, its silhouette dark against the lit window, its presence oppressive. Margaret turned and fled down the hill, her breath ragged as she ran back to her home, but the feeling of being watched lingered, creeping over her skin like a shadow she couldn't shake. The following days were marked by a growing unease. Margaret tried to put the events of that night out of her mind, but every time she glanced toward the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was waiting for her. Then, One evening, she decided to confront it. She returned to the mansion, determined to uncover the truth. But when she reached the gates, she was met with a shocking sight. The mansion was gone. In its place stood nothing but empty land, the foundation overgrown with weeds and the remnants of the building scattered around it like forgotten relics. The mirror, the figure, the house, it had all disappeared, as if it had never been there at all. Yet as Margaret stood at the edge of the foundation, she could feel it. The presence of something ancient and malevolent, still lingered in the air, and she knew then that the mansion of Blackstone Ridge was not just a building. It was a place, a threshold, where the past and the present blurred together, where the boundaries between the living and the dead were dangerously thin. Margaret left Blackstone Ridge soon after, but no matter where she went, she could never escape the feeling that the Watcher was still there, waiting for her in the shadows of the hollow. Story 20. Ashford Hollow was a town trapped in time. Nestled deep within a secluded valley, surrounded by mountains on all sides, it was a place that most outsiders only heard about in hushed whispers. To those who had lived there for generations, however, it was home, albeit a home burdened by strange happenings, unexplained events, and a lingering sense of dread that never seemed to dissipate. The most well-known legend of Ashford Hollow was the story of the old church at the heart of the town. It had once been the center of the community, where weddings, baptisms, and funerals were held. But one winter, the church had burned to the ground, and with it, any semblance of peace in the town. The fire had been a terrible thing, fierce and unrelenting. But what followed was worse. Those who had survived the blaze spoke of shadows moving within the ruins, of voices whispering in the wind, and of figures that could not possibly have been there. Many of the townspeople had moved away in the years that followed, unable to shake the memory of the fire or the strange occurrences that had come with it. But a few had remained, and those who stayed often spoke of a presence in the valley, a force that seemed to watch over them, unseen yet always there. The story of Ashford Hollow was one that Eve had heard as a child. She had grown up in the town, but like most others, she had left when she was old enough to start a life of her own. The memories of the fire, the rumors of the church's haunted ruins, had faded over time, replaced by the distractions of city life. But when Ev's father passed away and left her his house, she found herself returning to Ashford Hollow, not out of any desire to reconnect with her roots, but because there was simply nowhere else to go. The house was an old, weather-beaten structure, perched at the edge of town with a view of the valley below. It was a place she had spent countless days as a child, but now it felt unfamiliar, almost foreign to her. Eve arrived late in the afternoon, and after unpacking her things, she decided to take a walk around the town to reacquaint herself with the place she had once known. The town was quiet, unnervingly so. The streets were deserted, the windows of the houses dark, as though the entire town had been abandoned by its inhabitants. As she walked past the old churchyard, her eyes lingered on the ruins. The charred remnants of the foundation were still visible, the blackened stone a reminder of the fire that had claimed it. The wind whistled through the trees, carrying with it a faint, almost imperceptible whisper that seemed to come from the ruins. "Leave while you still can." The words were so faint that Eve almost convinced herself she had imagined them. She shook her head, attributing it to the wind, and continued her walk. That night, as the sun set and the town settled into darkness, Eve sat alone in the living room of her father's house. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows, and the house creaked in response, as though it were alive. Eve tried to ignore the strange feeling that had crept over her. It was as if something was watching her, waiting just beyond the edges of her perception. She dismissed the thought as nothing more than nerves. After all, it had been years since she had lived here, and the town's strange reputation had always been more of a local myth than anything tangible. But then, just as she was about to go to bed, she heard it, a soft, scratching sound, coming from the direction of the front door. She froze, her heart racing in her chest. The sound continued, growing louder, more insistent. She got up slowly, her feet cold against the wooden floor, and walked toward the door. As she reached for the doorknob, the scratching stopped. The silence that followed was even more unsettling. Hesitant, she opened the door, but there was nothing there. No one, nothing, just the wind swirling around in the darkness. Eve closed the door and locked it, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Eve tossed and turned, the strange sounds from the house still echoing in her mind. But just as she began to drift off, she was jolted awake by a loud bang from downstairs. She shot up in bed, her breath shallow and rapid. The noise had come from the kitchen, and she could feel her heart pounding in her chest. She tried to convince herself that it was just an old house settling, but something in the pit of her stomach told her it was something else. Something much worse. Something much worse. She got out of bed, her legs shaky beneath her, and cautiously made her way down the stairs. The kitchen was dark, the only light coming from the pale moonlight streaming through the window. Ev's eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of movement. The silence was suffocating. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A shadow flickering in the darkness. It moved across the far wall, too fast, too fluid to be natural. Ev's breath caught in her throat as the shadow seemed to turn toward her, its form shifting in the dim light. The temperature in the room dropped, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. Leave. Leave now, before it's too late. The voice came from nowhere, a low whisper that seemed to come from within the walls themselves. Eve backed away, her heart hammering in her chest. But as she turned to run, the door slammed shut behind her. Panic rose within her as she frantically tried to open it, but the handle wouldn't budge. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, and the whispering voice grew louder, more urgent. You have awoken it, and now it will not let you go. Eve turned in desperation, her eyes searching for any means of escape. But the shadows were closing in. They seemed to move, shifting across the walls, swirling around her. Presence was everywhere now, its cold fingers wrapping around her, pulling her deeper into its grasp. The whispering grew louder, now a chorus of voices, each one more frantic than the last. You should never have come back. You should have left when you had the chance. In the distance, Edith thought she saw something, an outline, standing just beyond the door. Its shape dark and indistinct, but it was moving toward her, its presence drawing closer. And she felt the overwhelming urge to scream. As she reached for the door again, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder, its grip firm and unyielding. The darkness pressed in around her, suffocating her, and she realized with a sickening certainty that she was not alone. The shadows of Ashford Hollow had claimed her, and there would be no escape. Story 21. Raven Hollow was a small, almost forgotten village, tucked away in the hills, far from any major roads or towns. To an outsider, it would have appeared as nothing more than a cluster of dilapidated houses surrounded by dense forests. There were no welcoming signs, no friendly faces in the village's borders. It had been years since anyone from outside had ventured in, and the locals preferred it that way. The few who still called Raven Hollow home never spoke much of the past, as if the years had erased all memories of it. But there was one story that still lingered in the air, passed on by hushed voices around the hearth. The story of the bells. Years ago, before the village had fallen into ruin, Raven Hollow had been known for its towering church. With its grand spire that reached toward the sky, the bells in the church's tower rang out every hour, their deep, resonant tones echoing through the hollow. It was a sound that brought comfort to the villagers, a reminder of time passing and lives continuing. But one night, the bells rang for the last time. It had been a particularly stormy evening, with rain falling in sheets and thunder cracking through the sky. The villagers gathered in the church for evening service, as they always did. But as the storm raged outside, something began to change. The bells, which had always chimed in harmony with the passage of time, suddenly began to toll out of rhythm. The sound grew louder, frantic, as if something or someone was forcing the bells to ring against their will. By the time the service had ended, the church was nearly empty, save for the few who stayed behind to investigate. And that was when it happened. The bell tower collapsed, a great crash that could be heard for miles. The church, once a proud structure, was reduced to rubble in an instant. Some said it was the storm that caused it. Others whispered of something more sinister. Something unnatural that had been lurking within the walls of the church. But what no one could explain was the sound that followed. After the church had fallen, there was silence, broken only by the distant rumbles of the storm. But in that silence, the bells could still be heard, faintly ringing in the distance, their sound echoing through the trees. It was as though the church had not truly fallen, as though the bells still continued their toll, haunting the hollow. The villagers, shaken by the events of that night, quickly abandoned the village. One by one, they packed up and left, seeking refuge in nearby towns. But the legend of the bells remained. In the years that followed, Raven Hollow was left to the elements. The houses fell into disrepair, the roads grew overgrown with weeds, and the church, once a towering figure in the center of the village, became nothing more than a pile of stone and timber. Yet, the bells, though no longer heard by human ears, seemed to echo in the hollow, faintly tolling, as if mourning the loss of what once was. Eve had heard the rumors of Raven Hollow long before she decided to visit. She had heard about the strange events, the abandoned houses, and the tale of the bells that never stopped ringing. It was the kind of story that piqued her curiosity, the kind of story that made her want to explore, to see for herself if there was any truth to the legends. When she arrived in the area, it was already late in the afternoon. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the landscape. The trees on the outskirts of the hollow looked dark and foreboding, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers reaching out toward the horizon. Eve parked her car at the edge of the village and stepped out into the cool evening air. The silence that greeted her was overwhelming. There was no breeze, no sound of animals, nothing but an eerie stillness that hung heavy in the air. She felt an uneasy chill run down her spine, but she brushed it off as nothing more than the tension of being in an unfamiliar place. The first house she came to was completely abandoned. The windows were boarded up, and the door hung crookedly on its hinges. The building had once been a home, but now it was little more than a hollow shell. Eve stepped closer, peering through the gaps in the wood, but saw nothing inside. It was the same with every house she passed. Each one had been deserted for years, left to decay in the elements. Yet, despite the clear signs of abandonment, the village still seemed alive. There was a palpable sense of presence in the air, as if the place itself was watching her, waiting. As Eve walked deeper into the hollow, she came to the ruins of the church. All that remained were broken walls, jagged pieces of stone, and a collapsed tower. The remnants of the bell tower were scattered across the ground, twisted metal and shattered rock mixed with the overgrown weeds. The silence around her was deafening. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and the faintest echo of something distant, something old, seemed to hum in the background. Ev's heart raced, but her curiosity pushed her forward. She stepped carefully over the rubble, making her way toward what had once been the altar. It was then that she heard it, a faint ringing, almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. The sound was unmistakable, the bells still tolling, though the church had been reduced to nothing more than ruins. The The sound seemed to come from all around her, echoing through the trees, vibrating in the very air itself. Eve froze, her breath catching in her throat. The ringing was not coming from anywhere nearby. It seemed to be coming from far off, as though the bells were ringing in another time, another place, and yet the sound felt as though it was right beside her, pressing in from all sides. Her feet carried her unwillingly, drawn to the sound as if by some invisible force. She didn't know why, but she found herself walking deeper into the woods, following the echo of the bells. The further she went, the louder the sound became. It was no longer a faint tolling. It was deafening, a constant ringing that rattled her bones. Her head ached from the noise, but she could not stop. The path through the forest was barely visible now, obscured by thick undergrowth, but she pressed on, driven by the need to follow the sound. It led her to a clearing, where the trees seemed to part just enough to reveal a stone structure in the center. The shape of the building was vague, obscured by the growing mist, but the bells were clearer now, their tolling louder and more insistent. Ev's eyes widened as she realized where she had come. It was the church, the original church, the one that had stood before the village had been abandoned. It was there, in front of her, whole and undisturbed by time. The bells hung above her, swaying gently as they rang in the air. But there was something wrong. The bells were not ringing of their own accord. They were being pulled, as if something invisible was forcing them to toll. And from the center of the church, something moved, a shadow that rippled and twisted, a presence that beckoned her forward. Eve stepped into the clearing, her feet heavy with dread, but her body compelled her to continue. She reached for the church's door, her hand trembling as she placed it on the cold stone. As soon as her fingers touched the door, the bells stopped, and in the silence that followed, a voice, hollow and ancient, whispered into her ear. The bells never stop ringing for those who are lost. And Eve realized, in that moment, she was never meant to leave Raven Hollow. Story 22. Blackthorn Ridge had always been a place of mystery. Situated on the edge of a remote mountain range, the ridge was infamous for its steep cliffs and treacherous paths. Those who dared venture into the area often returned with strange tales, speaking of voices on the wind and shadows that moved in the corner of their eyes. The locals, who had lived in the nearby village for generations, avoided it at all costs, preferring to stay within the safety of their homes rather than face whatever lay in the darkness of the ridge. It had become a place whispered about in hushed tones, a land that seemed to hold secrets not meant to be uncovered. Years ago, the ridge had been the site of a small settlement, a community of miners who had worked the rich veins of silver that ran deep beneath the earth. But after a series of unexplained disappearances, the town was abandoned, and the miners scattered. The last of the families left under the cover of night, never to return. No one could say exactly what had happened, but the legend of the Blackthorn Ridge grew with each passing year, as the wind howled through the empty town, and the cliffs seemed to beckon anyone foolish enough to approach. Amelia had heard the stories for years. She had grown up listening to the old folk in the village talk about the cursed ridge, their eyes wide with fear as they recounted the strange happenings that had plagued the miners. But she wasn't like the others. Amelia was driven by a need to understand, to seek out the truth behind the stories. She had spent years reading every account she could find, poring over old journals and maps, piecing together the fragments of the past. When she finally set out for Blackthorn Ridge, she knew she would be the one to uncover its secrets. Her journey began at the break of dawn. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting long shadows over the hills as Amelia made her way toward the ridge. The air was thick with mist, and the ground beneath her feet was damp from the previous night's rain. As she climbed higher, the forest grew denser, the trees towering over her like silent sentinels. The path was narrow, winding, and treacherous, but Amelia pressed on, her heart pounding with anticipation. She reached the foot of the ridge just as the sun disappeared behind a thick layer of clouds, casting the landscape into a strange twilight. The air grew colder, and a low rumble of thunder echoed through the mountains. For a moment, Amelia hesitated. Something about the place felt wrong, unnatural. The ridge loomed before her, its jagged peaks piercing the sky like the claws of some great beast. But she was determined. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to turn back now. She began to ascend the steep path, her breath growing heavier with each step. The higher she climbed, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The wind began to pick up, howling through the trees, carrying with it a strange, mournful sound that seemed to echo from deep within the ridge. It wasn't the wind itself, but the faint sound of something else, something human, or perhaps not. Amelia quickened her pace, pushing herself onward despite the growing sense of dread that gnawed at her insides. The path grew narrower, the cliffs on either side narrowing, until she was walking along a sheer drop, the ground beneath her feet barely wide enough for her boots. And then she saw it. At the top of the ridge, barely visible through the thick fog, stood the remnants of the old settlement. The houses were little more than crumbling stone foundations, overgrown with vines and moss, their roofs long since collapsed. The church, which had once served as the heart of the community, was now a hollow shell, its tall spire leaning precariously to one side. Amelia stepped cautiously into the abandoned town, her footsteps silent on the overgrown ground. The place seemed frozen in time, as if the inhabitants had simply vanished in an instant. There were no signs of struggle, no indication of what had happened. It was as if they had disappeared without a trace. The wind whistled through the empty streets, and Amelia's breath caught in her throat as she passed by the shattered windows of the church. Inside, the once pristine altar was now nothing more than a pile of broken wood and stone, scattered across the floor like the remnants of some forgotten ritual. The feeling of unease settled deeper into her chest as she moved through the village, her senses alert to every sound, every creak and groan of the decaying buildings around her. It was then that she noticed the footprints. They were faint, barely visible in the dust, but they were there, leading away from the church and toward the cliffside. They seemed fresh, as though someone had passed through recently. Amelia's heart skipped a beat. She wasn't alone. She followed the footprints, her footsteps soft against the ground as she moved toward the cliff's edge. The path grew more treacherous, the ground unstable, but the footprints were clear, leading her toward a narrow, winding trail that seemed to disappear into the mist. She hesitated for a moment, her mind racing with questions. Who had left these footprints? And why had they come this way? But before she could answer herself, the wind picked up once more, howling through the trees and sending a chill down her spine. Without thinking, she pressed on, following the trail as it led her deeper into the fog. The further she went, the more distorted the world around her became. The trees seemed to bend and shift, their shapes twisted and unnatural, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The mist grew thicker, obscuring her vision until she could barely see the ground beneath her feet. The wind carried whispers now, faint and unintelligible, like voices speaking in a language she couldn't understand. They seemed to echo from all directions, rising and falling in a strange, rhythmic pattern. Amelia's pulse quickened. She was close now, so close. She could feel it, the presence that lurked just beyond the veil of fog. She rounded a corner, and there in the distance, she saw the source of the footprints. A figure stood on the edge of the cliff, their back to her, silhouetted against the roiling sky. The figure was tall, its form cloaked in shadow, its features hidden in the swirling mist. Amelia opened her mouth to call out, but before she could make a sound, the figure turned. Its face was a hollow, empty void, its eyes dark and endless, staring into her soul. The wind died abruptly, leaving only the deafening silence. The figure's mouth opened, and for the first time, Amelia heard the words she had been searching for. "You should not have come." The voice was low and hollow, as though it came from the very depths of the earth. Amelia felt a coldness spread through her, a coldness that went beyond the chill of the mountain air. Her legs felt heavy, her body frozen in place. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure stepped closer, its form growing more defined in the mist, its presence overwhelming. "You have awakened what was meant to stay buried." The ground beneath her feet trembled, and the fog swirled around her like a living thing. Amelia tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. She was trapped, caught in the grip of something far older and more powerful than she had ever imagined. The figure reached out, its hand a shadow, and as it touched her, the world exploded in a burst of white light. When Amelia opened her eyes, she was no longer on the ridge. The village was gone. The cliff, the church. Everything was gone. All that remained was the endless fog, stretching out in all directions. And the voice, the hollow, haunting voice, echoed in her mind. "You are part of the ridge now." Story 23. Darkmoor Manor had stood for centuries, an imposing structure that overlooked the sleepy town below. Its dark stone walls were weathered by time, covered in creeping ivy that seemed to grow unchecked, as if the manor itself were alive. The house had once been the pride of the town, a symbol of wealth and power, owned by the wealthy Harrington family. But the manor had long since fallen into disrepair, its grand halls silent and empty, save for the whispers of its tragic past. No one in the town could remember the last time anyone had seen the Harringtons. The family had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only rumors and speculation. Some said they had fled under mysterious circumstances, while others whispered that something far darker had happened within the manor's walls. Over time, the manor became a place of legend, feared by the locals and avoided at all costs. It was said that those who ventured too close to its gates would hear strange noises echoing from the windows. Soft whispers, the sound of footsteps, the creaking of old floorboards. Others claimed to have seen figures moving behind the shattered windows, shadows that flickered in the darkness. But no one dared to enter. That was until Sarah arrived. Sarah was a writer, known for her books about the supernatural. She had spent years researching haunted places, visiting abandoned homes, and uncovering dark secrets. When she heard about Darkmoor Manor, she couldn't resist. The manor's history intrigued her, the mystery of the vanished family, and the eerie legends that surrounded it. She knew she had to see it for herself, to experience the house that had haunted the town for generations. When she arrived at Darkmoor Manor, it was just past dusk. The air was thick with fog, and the manor's silhouette loomed ominously against the fading light. The gates were rusted, the iron twisted and bent, as though they had not been touched in years. Sarah pushed them open with a creak, the sound echoing through the silence. As she walked up the long driveway, the gravel crunched beneath her feet, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease settling her chest. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes watching her every move. The front door was ajar, and Sarah stepped inside without hesitation, her heart racing with anticipation. The moment she entered, the air seemed to change. The house was cold, far colder than it should have been, and there was an oppressive silence that hung in the air, as if the manor itself were holding its breath. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she made her way through the grand hallway. Dust and cobwebs clung to the walls, and faded portraits of long-dead ancestors stared down at her from their frames. The faint smell of decay lingered in the air, mixed with the scent of mildew. As Sarah explored, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every step she took seemed to echo in the emptiness, and the shadows seemed to shift and move just beyond her line of sight. She told herself it was just her imagination, the product of years of research and stories. But deep down, she knew there was something wrong with this place. She wandered through the manor, her footsteps leading her deeper into the house. The further she went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, as if they were closing in on her. Finally, she reached the staircase that led to the upper floors. The stairs creaked as she ascended, the wood groaning beneath her weight. When she reached the top, she turned left and entered a large bedroom, the door swinging open with a loud bang. The room was as forgotten as the rest of the house, the furniture draped in white sheets, the floor covered in dust. Yet there was something strange about the room, a feeling of something waiting. As Sarah stepped further inside, she noticed something odd. In the far corner of the room, beneath the sheet-covered furniture, there was a small wooden chest. It seemed out of place, as though it had been deliberately left untouched. Curiosity got the better of her, and she moved toward it, her hands trembling as she reached for the lid. The moment her fingers brushed the chest, the air around her seemed to freeze. A low whisper echoed through the room, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Leave this place." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She pulled her hand back, but the chest remained in front of her, its lid slightly ajar. A dark, almost oppressive energy seemed to radiate from it, and for a moment she hesitated. But then, despite the warnings in her mind, she opened the chest. Inside there was nothing but old, yellowed papers, their edges frayed with age. She carefully unfolded one of the papers, her eyes scanning the faded ink. It was a letter, dated over 100 years ago. The handwriting was elegant, yet it trembled with fear. The letter spoke of a terrible secret, one that the Harrington family had tried to bury, a secret that was tied to the very foundation of Darkmoor Manor. As Sarah read the letter, the temperature in the room dropped even further. She could see her breath in front of her, swirling in the cold air. The letter spoke of a pact, a dark deal made by the Harringtons with something unknown, something that resided beneath the manor, something that had been feeding on the family's souls for generations. The pact had been sealed with blood, and the consequences were dire. The letter ended abruptly, the last few lines smudged, as if something had been wiped away. Sarah's hands shook as she closed the chest and backed away. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had uncovered something she wasn't supposed to. The shadows in the room seemed to press in closer, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You should have never come." The voice was not her own, not a voice that came from her, but from the very walls of the manor itself. The whispers grew into full-blown voices, chanting, calling, their words incomprehensible, but filled with malice. Sarah spun around, her heart racing, her breath coming in short gasps. The room seemed to twist around her, the walls closing in, and she felt an overwhelming pressure on her chest. She turned and ran, stumbling down the stairs, the whispers following her every step. As she reached the main hallway, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. In the doorway, standing in the dim light, was a figure. It was tall, its features obscured by shadows, but its eyes, those eyes glowed with an unnatural light, a pale, ghostly glow that pierced through the darkness. The figure raised one long, bony hand, pointing toward the door, its mouth opening as if to speak. But no words came. Instead, a deafening roar filled the house, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The figure lunged at her, its long, gnarled fingers reaching for her throat. Sarah screamed, her legs carrying her out the door and into the night. She ran through the fog, her breath ragged in her chest, her body shaking with fear. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how far she went. She couldn't escape the feeling that something was chasing her. Something that was far older than the house, far older than the town. As she reached the edge of the property, she dared a glance over her shoulder. The manor stood in the distance, its dark silhouette illuminated by the flickering glow of the figure's eyes. The whispers were gone, but the chilling silence remained, a silence that seemed to follow her every step. Sarah never returned to Darkmoor Manor. She left the town behind, unable to shake the feeling that whatever had been unleashed there was still watching. Still watching. They still linger in the wind, carried by the night air, a warning to anyone who dares to come too close. Story 23. Darkmoor Manor had stood for centuries, an imposing structure that overlooked the sleepy town below. Its dark stone walls were weathered by time, covered in creeping ivy that seemed to grow unchecked, as if the manor itself were alive. The house had once been the pride of the town, a symbol of wealth and power, owned by the wealthy Harrington family. But the manor had long since fallen into disrepair, its grand halls silent and empty, save for the whispers of its tragic past. No one in the town could remember the last time anyone had seen the Harringtons. The family had disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only rumors and speculation. Some said they had fled under mysterious circumstances, while others whispered that something far darker had happened within the manor's walls. Over time, the manor became a place of legend, feared by the locals and avoided at all costs. It was said that those who ventured too close to its gates would hear strange noises echoing from the windows. Soft whispers, the sound of footsteps, the creaking of old floorboards. Others claimed to have seen figures moving behind the shattered windows, shadows that flickered in the darkness. But no one dared to enter. That was until Sarah arrived. Sarah was a writer, known for her books about the supernatural. She had spent years researching haunted places, visiting abandoned homes, and uncovering dark secrets. When she heard about Darkmoor Manor, she couldn't resist. The manor's history intrigued her, the mystery of the vanished family, and the eerie legends that surrounded it. She knew she had to see it for herself, to experience the house that had haunted the town for generations. When she arrived at Darkmoor Manor, it was just past dusk. The air was thick with fog, and the manor's silhouette loomed ominously against the fading light. The gates were rusted, the iron twisted and bent, as though they had not been touched in years. Sarah pushed them open with a creak, the sound echoing through the silence. As she walked up the long driveway, the gravel crunched beneath her feet, and she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease settle in her chest. The house loomed ahead, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes watching her every move. The front door was ajar, and Sarah stepped inside without hesitation, her heart racing with anticipation. The moment she entered, the air seemed to change. The house was cold, far colder than it should have been, and there was an oppressive silence that hung in the air, as if the manor itself were holding its breath. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she made her way through the grand hallway. Dust and cobwebs clung to the walls, and faded portraits of long-dead ancestors stared down at her from their frames. The faint smell of decay lingered in the air, mixed with the scent of mildew. As Sarah explored, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every step she took seemed to echo in the emptiness, and the shadows seemed to shift and move just beyond her line of sight. She told herself it was just her imagination, the product of years of research and stories. But deep down, she knew there was something wrong with this place. She wandered through the manor, her footsteps leading her deeper into the house. The further she went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to grow darker, thicker, as if they were closing in on her. Finally, she reached the staircase that led to the upper floors. The stairs creaked as she ascended, the wood groaning beneath her weight. When she reached the top, she turned left and entered a large bedroom, the door swinging open with a loud bang. The room was as forgotten as the rest of the house, the furniture draped in white sheets, the floor covered in dust. Yet there was something strange about the room, a feeling of something waiting. As Sarah stepped further inside, she noticed something odd. In the far corner of the room, beneath the sheet-covered furniture, there was a small wooden chest. It seemed out of place, as though it had been deliberately left untouched. Curiosity got the better of her, and she moved toward it, her hands trembling as she reached for the lid. The moment her fingers brushed the chest, the air around her seemed to freeze. A low whisper echoed through the room, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Leave this place." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She pulled her hand back, but the chest remained in front of her, its lid slightly ajar. A dark, almost oppressive energy seemed to radiate from it, and for a moment she hesitated. But then, despite the warnings in her mind, she opened the chest. Inside there was nothing but old, yellowed papers, their edges frayed with age. She carefully unfolded one of the papers, her eyes scanning the faded ink. It was a letter, dated over 100 years ago. The handwriting was elegant, yet it trembled with fear. The letter spoke of a terrible secret, one that the Harrington family had tried to bury, a secret that was tied to the very foundation of Dartmoor Manor. As Sarah read the letter, the temperature in the room dropped even further. She could see her breath in front of her, swirling in the cold air. The letter spoke of a pact, a dark deal made by the Harringtons with something unknown, something that resided beneath the manor, something that had been feeding on the family's souls for generations. The pact had been sealed with blood, and the consequences were dire. The letter ended abruptly, the last few lines smudged, as if something had been wiped away. Sarah's hands shook as she closed the chest and backed away. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had uncovered something she wasn't supposed to. The shadows in the room seemed to press in closer, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. "You should have never come." The voice was not her own, not a voice that came from her, but from the very walls of the manor itself. The whispers grew into full-blown voices, chanting, calling, their words incomprehensible, but filled with malice. Sarah spun around, her heart racing, her breath coming in short gasps. The room seemed to twist around her, the walls closing in, and she felt an overwhelming pressure on her chest. She turned and ran, stumbling down the stairs, the whispers following her every step. As she reached the main hallway, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. In the doorway, standing in the dim light, was a figure. It was tall, its features obscured by shadows, but its eyes, those eyes glowed with an unnatural light, a pale, ghostly glow that pierced through the darkness. The figure raised one long, bony hand, pointing toward the door, its mouth opening as if to speak. But no words came. Instead, a deafening roar filled the house, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The figure lunged at her, its long, gnarled fingers reaching for her throat. Sarah screamed, her legs carrying her out the door and into the night. She ran through the fog, her breath ragged in her chest, her body shaking with fear. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how far she went, she couldn't escape the feeling that something was chasing her. Something that was far older than the house, far older than the town. As she reached the edge of the property, she dared a glance over her shoulder. The manor stood in the distance, its dark silhouette illuminated by the flickering glow of the figure's eyes. The whispers were gone, but the chilling silence remained. a silence that seemed to follow her every step. Sarah never returned to Darkmoor Manor. She left the town behind, unable to shake the feeling that whatever had been unleashed there was still watching. Still watching. They still linger in the wind, carried by the night air, a warning to anyone who dares to come too close. Story 24. Ravenshade Forest had always been a place of mystery and fear. Nestled in the heart of a forgotten valley, it was a forest that seemed to defy the natural order. The trees grew tall and twisted, their branches intertwining like dark fingers clawing at the sky. The air was thick with fog, and the ground beneath was perpetually damp, as though the forest had never seen sunlight. For generations, the people of the nearby village had avoided it, speaking of it only in whispers. It was said to be cursed, haunted by the restless spirits of those who had vanished within its depths. Over the years, many had ventured into the forest, but none had returned. The village elders often spoke of strange happenings within the woods, mysterious lights that danced among the trees, unearthly sounds that echoed through the night, and a chilling, oppressive presence that seemed to seep into the very air. Some believed that the forest was alive, that it fed off the souls of those who dared to enter. Others believed that it was the home of an ancient evil, one that had been awakened long ago, and was now biding its time, waiting for the next unfortunate soul to cross its threshold. Emma had grown up hearing these tales, her curiosity piqued by the stories of those who had disappeared. She was no stranger to the supernatural, having spent years studying ancient folklore and the paranormal. Her interest in Ravenshade Forest had grown over time, fueled by the many stories that surrounded it. Emma wasn't the type to believe in superstitions, but something about the forest's reputation had always intrigued her. When she decided to take a trip to the village to investigate, the locals tried to warn her. They begged her to turn back, to leave the forest untouched. But Emma was determined. She needed to understand what had happened to those who had vanished. As she entered the forest, the first thing she noticed was the silence. The usual sounds of nature, birds singing, leaves rustling, were absent. It was as though the forest itself had held its breath, watching her every move. The path ahead was narrow, winding between ancient trees whose gnarled roots seemed to twist and writhe beneath her feet. The fog hung thick in the air, making it difficult to see more than a few feet in front of her. Emma pressed on, her heart pounding in her chest. The further she walked, the more the forest seemed to close in around her, the trees growing taller and denser, blocking out what little light managed to filter through the mist. As she ventured deeper, the temperature dropped, and a cold, damp chill settled over her skin. Her breath came in shallow bursts, visible in the air as it misted before her. Then she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible above the sound of her own footsteps. She stopped, straining her ears to catch the sound. It was soft at first, like the wind through the trees, but as she stood there, it became clearer. The whispering voices, too many to count, seemed to be speaking in a language she didn't understand. The words were unintelligible, but the tone was unmistakably urgent, filled with an emotion she couldn't place. Leave now. Leave before it finds you. Emma's blood ran cold. She spun around, scanning the area behind her, but saw nothing. Only the thick fog, swirling like a living thing, and the oppressive darkness of the trees. Her instincts told her to turn back, to run, but her curiosity pushed her forward. She had come too far to stop now. As she continued down the path, the whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it was a constant, maddening hum in the back of her mind. Every step she took seemed to echo in the silence, as though the forest itself were watching her. Then she saw it. In the distance, the flicker of light, like a candle flame dancing in the dark. At first, she thought it was just her eyes playing tricks on her. But as she moved closer, she realized it was real. The light seemed to move, floating just above the ground, leading her deeper into the forest. It beckoned her forward, drawing her in with an almost hypnotic pull. Despite the sense of dread that was growing in her chest, Emma couldn't resist. She followed the light, her footsteps quickening as the mist closed in around her. The trees seemed to shift and bend as she moved, their twisted branches blocking the path ahead. The further she went, the more the forest seemed to change. The air grew thicker, suffocating, and the light grew brighter, blinding her with its intensity. Suddenly, the light vanished. Emma stopped dead in her tracks, her heart pounding in her chest. The fog around her swirled, and the whispering voices returned, louder than ever, filling her ears with their frantic, urgent calls. Turn back, you have been warned. She spun around, her eyes darting in every direction, but there was no sign of the light, only darkness. And then, she heard something else, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from behind her. She froze, every muscle in her body tensing with fear. Slowly, she turned around, her breath caught in her throat. Emerging from the shadows, just beyond the reach of the mist, was a figure. At first, it seemed human, but as it stepped into the dim light, Emma's heart sank. Its skin was ashen gray, stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to pierce through her, and its mouth was filled with rows of jagged, sharp teeth. The creature took a step forward, its movements slow and deliberate, and Emma could feel its gaze on her, heavy and unblinking. "You should not have come here," the creature hissed, its voice like the rustling of dead leaves. Emma backed away, her mind racing, trying to find an escape. But the forest seemed to close in around her, trapping her in place. The creature stepped closer, its breath hot and rancid, and Emma could feel its presence pressing down on her, suffocating her. The whispering voices had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence that made her ears ring. The creature lunged at her, its claws extending as it reached for her throat. Emma screamed, stumbling backward, her foot catching on a root, sending her crashing to the ground. She scrambled to get up, her heart racing as she looked for any sign of escape. The creature was still coming, its monstrous form closing in with every passing second. But as she turned to run, something strange happened. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and a loud cracking sound echoed through the forest. The trees around her shook violently, their roots twisting and rising from the earth like serpents. The creature paused, its head tilting as it looked around in confusion. And then, from deep within the forest, Emma heard a new sound, a roar, a deafening, primal roar that seemed to shake the very air. The creature recoiled, its eyes wide with fear, and it took a step back. For a brief moment, Emma saw something massive, shadowy and indistinct, moving through the trees. The creature let out a low, terrified hiss and fled, disappearing into the fog. Emma didn't wait to see what had scared it away. She ran, her legs aching with exhaustion as she stumbled through the fog, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't stop until she reached the edge of the forest, her body trembling with fear. When she turned back, Ravenshade Forest was quiet once more. The fog had lifted, and the trees stood still, as though nothing had ever happened. But Emma knew the truth. The forest wasn't just cursed. It was alive, and whatever lived within it had been watching her, waiting for her to uncover its secrets. As she left the forest behind, Emma knew that she would never forget what she had seen, and she would never, ever return to Ravenshade Forest. F-I-E-D-D. Story 25. Millbrook Lake was a serene body of water, tucked away between the rolling hills of a small, quiet town. The lake shimmered in the sunlight, its surface reflecting the clear blue sky and the surrounding forests that stretched for miles. But beneath the calm waters, there was a darkness that had haunted the town for generations. Locals rarely spoke of it, but it was known that Millbrook Lake was not a place to be taken lightly. The lake had a history of strange disappearances, unexplained deaths, and eerie happenings that no one could quite explain. It was said that something lurked beneath its surface, something ancient and malevolent, a presence that had claimed the lives of those who ventured too far into its depths. Despite the warnings, there were always those who ignored the tales and tried to uncover the lake's secrets. Some came seeking adventure, others seeking the thrill of the unknown. But none ever returned the same, if they returned at all. For years, the lake was avoided by most, with only a few brave souls daring to fish from its shores, or take a boat out onto its placid surface. The town's elders would gather around their fireplaces at night, telling stories of those who had vanished, their voices trembling with fear as they spoke of the creature beneath the water. As the years passed, the legends faded, and the lake became just another quiet spot in the town. But for one man, the mystery of Millbrook Lake had never been fully laid to rest. Thomas was a journalist, known for his investigative reporting on unsolved mysteries and paranormal events. He had spent his career chasing stories that others were too afraid to touch. When he first heard about the strange happenings at Millbrook Lake, he knew he had to see it for himself. The stories of people disappearing without a trace, of eerie sounds rising from the depths at night, had intrigued him. He was determined to uncover the truth, to find out if the rumors were just that, rumors, or if something far darker was at work. He arrived in Millbrook on a crisp autumn morning, the mist rising from the lake as he stood on the shore, looking out at the still waters. The town seemed quiet, almost too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Thomas made his way to the local inn, where he was greeted by the owner, a woman named Margaret who had lived in the town all her life. She welcomed him with a warm smile, but her eyes were filled with worry. "You're not planning to go out on the lake, are you?" she asked, her voice low. "It's not safe. Not anymore." Thomas smiled, assuring her that he was just there to do some research. He had heard the stories, of course, but he wasn't one to believe in superstitions. There had to be a logical explanation for the strange events surrounding the lake, and he was determined to find it. That afternoon, he rented a small rowboat from the local marina and set out onto the lake. The water was eerily calm, the only sound being a gentle lapping of the waves against the boat's hull. As he rowed deeper into the lake, the shoreline became a distant blur, the trees and hills blending into the mist. The further he went, the more the air seemed to grow thick, heavy with an unseen weight. Thomas's curiosity pushed him forward. He didn't believe in ghosts or supernatural creatures, but there was something about this place that unsettled him. There was an unnatural stillness in the air, as if the entire lake was holding its breath, waiting for something. As he passed the old boathouse on the far side of the lake, he noticed something strange. The water around him seemed to ripple, even though there was no wind. At first, he thought it was just his imagination, but as he looked closer, he saw a shape just beneath the surface of the water. It was large, moving slowly, as if it were aware of his presence. Thomas's heart skipped a beat. He had read the stories of the creature that was said to dwell in the depths of the lake, but he had never truly believed them. Now, seeing this shape, he wasn't so sure. He reached for his camera, his hands shaking as he tried to steady the lens on the water. He snapped a few photos, but the shape was already sinking back into the darkness below. For a moment, everything was still. The ripples faded, and the water once again became calm, as if nothing had happened. Thomas sat in the boat, staring at the spot where the shape had disappeared. He didn't know what he had seen, but it had been too real to ignore. His mind raced with questions. Had he just witnessed a large fish or some other creature? Or was there truly something in the lake? Something that had been waiting for him? He decided to continue his investigation. He rowed to the center of the lake, his eyes scanning the water for any signs of movement. The sun began to set, casting a golden glow across the water. But the peaceful sight did little to ease his growing unease. The air had grown colder, and the once clear sky was now overcast with heavy clouds. As he turned to row back to shore, a low sound echoed across the water. At first, it was distant, barely audible. But as it grew louder, Thomas realized it was the sound of something moving beneath the water. It was a deep, guttural noise, like a low growl or the rumble of an animal. The sound seemed to come from all around him, rising from the depths, swirling around the boat. His eyes darted to the water, searching for any sign of movement. But all he saw was the stillness of the lake. The noise grew louder, more insistent, as if something was approaching. Something massive. Something ancient. Suddenly, the water around him exploded in a spray of foam. A massive form shot to the surface, rising from the depths with terrifying speed. Thomas's heart froze in his chest as he stared at the creature before him. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its body was long and serpentine, covered in dark, slimy scales that glistened in the dim light. Its eyes were huge, black as night, and they locked onto him with an intensity that made his blood run cold. The creature's mouth opened wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the fading light. It lunged at the boat, its massive form sending waves crashing into the sides. Thomas barely had time to react before the creature's jaws closed around the boat's edge, splintering the wood like it was nothing. He screamed, grabbing onto the sides of the boat as it began to tip. The creature's long, serpentine body coiled around the boat, dragging it beneath the water. In a panic, Thomas tried to swim, but the creature was faster, its grip tightening around him like a vice. His limbs were paralyzed with fear, and his lungs burned as he fought against the crushing pressure of the water. As his vision blurred and darkness closed in, Thomas realized that he had made a terrible mistake. He had come to Millbrook Lake seeking answers, but the only thing he had found was death. The creature that had lurked beneath the water for so long had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many others before him. By the time the local authorities arrived, there was nothing left of Thomas but his camera, floating on the surface of the lake. The creature had vanished back into the depths, and the lake was once again calm. But the town would never forget what had happened, and neither would the lake. Millbrook Lake remained a place of mystery, its dark waters hiding the secrets of the creature that dwelled beneath. And for those who dared to venture too close, the lake's curse would continue to claim new victims, one by one.